Chapter 439. When Brando took out the gemstone, a ray of gray light shot out from it and pierced through the fog as if it was pointing in a certain direction. "What is this?" Fina asked. "Why should I answer you? You cruise people don't care about Erwin's answer, do you?" Brando raised the gemstone like a lighthouse in the fog. "Why you?" Fina was speechless. But Brando ignored her and continued forward, and Fina followed him without a word. The light from the gemstone was actually some kind of resonance, and the other end of the resonance was in the abyss. The two of them walked for a while in the fog. The scenery around them was constantly changing, and there seemed to be a layer of flowing water beneath their feet. The monotonous scenery made them sleepy, but after they advanced for a while, the gem in Brendel's hand suddenly dimmed. "What's wrong?" Fina asked curiously when she saw it. "We're here." Brando kept the gemstone and leaned against a rock. Even though this was part of his plan, the Mistborn was not as easy to deal with as Andesha. Then he carefully poked his head out from behind the rock and saw a huge crater behind the white fog. But when he looked down, he immediately held his breath. What kind of scene was that? There was a prehistoric beast lying in the crater. But it was not a hydra like Brando had imagined. It was a wolf, and its tail was as long as the canyon. The wolf was sleeping, and its body was as white as snow. Its silver hair shone in the darkness. But even if its body was curled into a ball, it was still more magnificent than the most majestic mountain in the canyon. Its huge and beautiful mouth was placed on its front paw. Its eyes were closed, and there was a silver scar on its eyelid and one side of its cheek. Brando looked at it and gulped. He almost forgot to breathe. At this time, Fina also poked her head out from behind him. Her eyes widened and she almost screamed, but she quickly covered her mouth with her hands. "What is this?" Fina asked in disbelief. Brendel's eyes lit up as he looked at the giant wolf. He took a deep breath and said, "Son of the 12 moons, Warg Hattie." Vahina covered her mouth and cried out as well. The alpha wolf Ekis was the son of the 12 moons, the source of the calamity of the wolves. The northern border of the Cruz Empire was constantly invaded by the calamity of the wolves, and Fina naturally knew about it. But the alpha wolf Ekis was the son of a demigod. Even though there were countless legends about it, no one believed that such a creature actually existed in the real world. "How could this be? Why, you're not mistaken, are you?" Fina stammered. "The giant white wolf is Hattie, not to mention that there is a wound on its right eye from the battle with the winter wolf." Brando suddenly paused. He suddenly thought that this thing could be one of the forms of the nightmare mist. After all, if it could turn into the Saint Hydra, why couldn't it turn into Ekis? But at this time he suddenly felt Fina poking his waist from behind. "Brando?" Fina looked up and sucked in a cold breath. She seemed to be tongue-tied. Brendel saw the young lady's expression as if she had seen a ghost, and he immediately became alert. He raised his head and suddenly saw an unbelievable scene. Above the alpha wolf Ekis, the majestic atmosphere slowly changed into various shapes. One moment, it was the Saint Hydra, the next, it was other mythical creatures. But the fog slowly gathered and finally turned into the image of the Saint Hydra with 15 heads. The phantom of the ancestral beast appeared in the sky. However, 15 pairs of blood-red eyes suddenly opened, exposing themselves to the murderous and malicious gazes. Brando and Fina felt a chill in their hearts, as if they were pierced by 15 sharp swords and nailed to the ground. At the same time, Brando suddenly thought of a possibility. He looked at the sleeping Ekis and then at the huge phantom in the sky. If this was a dream of the alpha wolf Ekis, then the ability to affect another world through a dream was a real nightmare mist. No wonder it was called a nightmare mist. So this thing was just a dream of Ekis? How could a dream be so powerful? "It saw us?" Vahina stammered. Brando quickly pulled her back. "Don't be silly. It hasn't seen us yet. It would have attacked us if it saw us. Be quiet, don't attract that thing here." He then looked at the 15 dragon heads above the abyss, knowing that the gray gemstone in his hand had been sensed by the other party, which was why the misty nightmare reacted. But it was strange, how did the gray gemstone have anything to do with Hattie? With that in mind, he withdrew his gaze from behind the boulder and pulled Vahina back as well. "You want to lure that woman here?" Fina crouched behind the rock and put her hand on her skirt. Although the edges of her skirt were torn beyond recognition, she lowered her head and thought for a moment. Brando was stunned. He looked at the blonde girl with twin ponytails in surprise. "I didn't know you were smart." What are you talking about?" Fina gritted her teeth and glared at Brando. Brando glared at her. Fina was shocked and quickly lowered her voice. "How did you know there would be such a thing here?" Is it related to the gem in your hand? Brando chuckled. You guessed right. Guess again. Tisich, even an idiot can see through your plan. You think you're so smart? Brendel coughed and his face was a little hot, but he immediately retorted, Is that so? No wonder you saw through it. Faina raised her eyebrows. Her twin ponytails were about to explode. But when she saw Brando put a finger to his lips, she immediately deflated. Hateful Aween country bumpkin. She muttered under her breath. But Brando was not in the mood to bicker with her. He turned around and looked at the surrounding terrain. He chose a spot where the Lernea Hydra would not be able to spot him easily. He then gestured to Faina and led her there. It was a crack in the cliff. From there, one could clearly see the entire valley of the abyss. There was also a huge crater on the other side. He chose this spot to avoid the Lernea Hydra's gaze, and also to monitor Andesha's movements. He calculated that she would catch up to them in 10 minutes at most. As expected, the Lord of Withering Tears figure appeared in the fog. She had followed the tracks left behind by Brendel and Faina, but it was difficult for her. She could only rely on the remnants of their scent to track them down in the rocky wastelands. Andesha was still quite a distance away from the crater. She did not notice the Lernea Hydra's presence in the sky, and she happened to be in the Lernea Hydra's blind spot. Brando knew that he could not let her go any further. Otherwise she would be alerted. He had to finish the deed before the woman realized what was going on. He took a deep breath. I'll talk. Bumpkin, will your plan work? Faina saw Andesha's appearance and her body tensed up. She swallowed her saliva and asked anxiously. Brendel glared at her, thinking that the courage and calmness that he had worked so hard to gather was completely defeated by this woman's words. But he did not have time to think. When he took out the gray gemstone, the Lernea Hydra's phantom slowly moved. It seemed to have sensed the presence of the gray gemstone, and its 15 heads surrounded it. It's here. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He raised the gray gemstone, and the Lernea Hydra's phantom in the sky moved. Their target was the cliff in this direction. Bumpkin, what are you doing? Faina looked at him and felt that something was wrong. Brando did not intend to answer her, and he did not have the time to do so. One of the Lernea Hydra's heads swooped down from the sky. Brando did not have the time to think. He immediately pushed Faina away and rolled to the side, causing the Lernea Hydra's jaws to miss. He then grabbed Vahina's hand and started running. Behind him, the Hydra's 4 heads broke through the fog and caught up to them in an instant. One of the heads even brushed past their heads, causing Vahina to shriek and crouch down to cover her head. Brando had no choice but to turn around and support her back with one hand while the other wrapped around her legs. He then carried her and ran down the canyon. Fortunately, the Lernea Hydra's multiple heads could not attack at the same time in this abyss. Otherwise, they would have surrounded Brando in an instant. But now, the 15 heads had to block each other, so they were slower than Brando by a beat. Furthermore, there were many cracks in the cliff, and the Lernea Hydra could not do anything to him as he weaved through the cracks. Brando quickly slid down the cliff with Faina in his arms. He turned a corner in the valley and immediately bumped into Andesha, who was walking out of the fog. Andesha was still holding onto Azure Firmament's scabbard, which had fallen into the valley when he was trying to draw his sword. Azure Firmament was a fantasy weapon, and its scabbard was made of special materials. Even though it fell from such a height, it did not break. But the tree herder's patriarch was stunned when she saw Brando carrying Faina through the fog and landing in front of her. Her purple eyes stared at the youth in surprise. She was stunned for a moment before she teased him. What? Did you deliver yourself to me? Brando shook his head. It seems like you already know that the Lionheart is not with me. He took a deep breath and looked at the scabbard in Andesha's hand. Andesha snorted coldly, It doesn't matter. The Angel of Darkness is more important to me. Then what about this? What is it? Andesha was stunned by Brando's words, but Brando had already thrown the gem to her. Andesha's first reaction was to whip it away, but when she saw the gem, her expression changed. A seal shard? Andesha immediately used her vine whip to retrieve the gemstone. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 440. Andesha caught the gemstone with one hand, and a roar that shook the entire valley came from behind the fog. The fog suddenly split into two, and a large dragon head opened its mouth and pounced towards her without any warning. Dragon? Andesha was shocked, and she immediately chanted an incantation. Northern Wind, I command you to show yourself to the world. She stretched out her hand and a snowstorm appeared behind her. Sharp ice crystals shot forward like knives, and the snowstorm passed through Andesha's shoulders and body, but she was unharmed. Andesha's hair fluttered in the wind, but she did not move at all. Andesha was like a queen of ice. She remained motionless, but in an instant, a thick layer of ice covered the ground in front of her. Strong winds and snow covered almost half of the valley. Even the Saint Hydra had no choice but to retreat. The sharp ice crystals pierced through its body, riddling it with holes. Andesha sensed that there was something wrong with this dragon. She pointed at one of the heads and said, "Time will pass. Your scales will fall from your body, your muscles will rot, your blood will dry up, and your bones will rot. Your days are numbered and you will rest in peace." The Saint Hydra suddenly roared, and the scales on its sacred white body began to fall off. Then its flesh and blood fell like rain, turning into mist and fusing into the valley. Almost in an instant, the huge head completely vanished into thin air. But before Andesha could heave a sigh of relief, the air suddenly rippled, and the disintegrated head of the Lernea Hydra reappeared. Andesha frowned. Brando and Vahina took the opportunity to sneak past the battlefield while Andesha and the Nightmare Fog were busy fighting. In truth, Brando had already activated charge when Andesha's attention was drawn to the Lernea Hydra. But even so, he was still too slow and the snowstorm landed on his shoulder. He could not feel anything on his right shoulder, and it was covered in a layer of white frost. He gritted his teeth and carried Vahina 100 meters away, and entered a crevice. Even though the battle outside was earth-shattering, it was still relatively quiet here. Brando stopped and sucked in a breath of cold air. His shoulder felt like it had been stabbed by a knife. It was said that when the pain reached a certain level, there was not much difference between burns, frostbite, and sword wounds. At least that was what he thought. Vahina saw that Brando's face was contorted in pain, and could not help but ask with concern, "Hey, country bumpkin? What's wrong?" Brando gasped. Vahina wanted to care for Brando's shoulder, but she was annoyed when she saw his nonchalant attitude. She snorted and said stiffly, "It's nothing." But after a while she whispered, "Hey, country bumpkin. What now? Miss, do you think I'm very free?" Brendel was out of breath. You're so petty. Are you saying that you're apologizing to me for your previous actions?" Vahina's sharp eyebrows shot up. "Of course not. Why would you think of that? Why would I apologize to a country bumpkin like you?" "Then what are you trying to say?" The noble lady blushed, which was a rare sight. She wanted to say, "Your shoulder is in so much pain, let me down and I'll walk on my own." However, her words changed into, "Hey, when are you going to put me down?" Her voice became softer and softer. It was only then that Brendel remembered that he was still hugging Faina. It was not his fault. Hugging Faina felt like handing over a package. If it was any other girl hugging him, he might have fantasized about it, but he really did not have a good impression of Faina. She was arrogant, conceited, evil, and clumsy. He couldn't help but glance at the noble's daughter and put her down. At this moment, the battle between the Saint Hydra and Andesha had reached its climax. The Misty Nightmare's 15 heads were constantly disintegrating and reassembling under Andesha's barrage of attacks, but the Misty Nightmare was forced to retreat without any room to retaliate. Brando was shocked when he saw this scene. Even though he knew that Andesha was powerful, he did not expect her to be this powerful. The Saint Hydra was a ferocious beast that had chased after Amon, Mephisto, Veronica, as well as the entire Holy Cathedral squad. Yet, it could only defend itself in the hands of one of the 12 patriarchs. However, the Saint Hydra's ability to reassemble itself was something that ignored Andesha's stamina. If Andesha could not find the key to solving this problem, she would be dragged to her death. Andesha's element was erosion, and she was not as fast as Veronica's wind. She could come and go as she pleased. But no matter what, Brando knew that it was best for them to leave. He wanted to return the way he came, but he suddenly thought that the entrance to the center of the loop of trade winds might be behind Ekis' lair. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible, and he decided to pass through from the other side. This way they would have to pass right under the Saint Hydra's nose. It was dangerous, but Brando felt that it was worth it. The Saint Hydra and Andesha were locked in a fierce battle, and it would not notice them easily. Furthermore, the gray gemstone was not in his hands. Yellow rays of light flashed above their heads from time to time. Those were the effects of Andesha's spells, and the Saint Hydra's roars echoed throughout the valley. It was as if the sky was about to collapse. The two of them carefully moved forward while holding onto the walls. Sand and gravel fell from the ground as the ground rumbled. Faina frowned, but she did not dare to complain. She only glanced at Brando from time to time. The two of them quickly walked out of the valley through the crisscrossing rock crevices. Although the sky and earth were changing colors in the valley, it did not affect the outside world. When they walked out of the crevice, the first thing they saw was the giant beast lying quietly in the center of the huge pit. Wait, we're going to go through there? Faina suddenly noticed Brando's intentions. She pointed to the side of the Saint Hydra and asked with a pale expression. Of course. Alpha Wolf Ekis? It's sleeping, what are you afraid of? What if it suddenly wakes up? Won't we be dead? Brando showed a look of disdain. That's the demigod's slumber, it won't wake up so easily. Are you still sleeping, Miss Faina? Faina gritted her teeth. She knew about the demigod's slumber. Gods would sleep for thousands of years, and they would not wake up no matter what happened. However, that was just a legend. Now that he was in the situation, it was completely different. The Alpha Wolf, Hattie, was the source of countless legendary wolf disasters. It was a white spirit, and it had an innate hatred for humans. In Cruz, every child grew up listening to the stories of white wolves that devoured humans under the moonlight. Faina was no exception. Now that she saw the source of the legend with her own eyes, she could not help but lose her ability to think. But Brando had already taken the lead. Even though she was afraid, she had no choice but to follow him. The two of them quickly reached the bottom of the pit. The explosions in the valley were still ongoing, which meant that the battle between Andesha and the Hydra was still ongoing. It was just that there was a thick layer of fog between them, and the sound was clearly very far away. Then, the two of them slowly passed by the side of that gigantic and graceful creature. They raised their heads and looked at this silver-white giant wolf's figure that was as graceful as a mountain range in the dark night. They couldn't help but feel a sense of insignificance and reverence. It was an instinctive reverence for power. The sleeping Alpha Wolf Ekis was like a small mountain. Her breathing was long, and the silver hair on her back moved up and down. It was proof that a powerful soul was still pulsating in her body. But the wind around her seemed to have stopped, as if the center of the world was gathered there. So this is the Alpha Wolf Ekis. Brando could not help but think. Even though he knew that he would not wake Ekis up, he still subconsciously held his breath. Faina was the same. Her face was pale. Why won't he wake up even if we're so close? She stammered. Why would he wake up? Isn't the Alpha Wolf Ekis the enemy of all intelligent beings? That's why he'll send out a pack of winter wolves to bite your neck. Brando gestured at Faina with his claws, causing her to shrink back in fear. What are you doing? I'm just telling you to cut the crap. Damn it, you country bumpkin. Faina grumbled unhappily. The two of them passed by the head wolf Hattie one after the other. When they passed by the head of the huge creature on its front paw, they both felt their hearts beating a little faster. But fortunately Brando was not wrong. The demigod's slumber would not be awakened so easily. Faina even asked why they did not kill Hattie while it was asleep, but Brendel merely glanced at her and passed the azure firmament to her, telling her, "You're right, Hattie, you're right. I'll leave the responsibility of saving the world to you, young lady." Faina did not say anything after that, only staring at Brando with malicious intent. The reason was simple. She actually plucked up the courage to slash at one of the silver hairs of the Alpha Wolf, Hattie. As a result, the long sword was blocked by an invisible barrier before it could even get close to Hattie's body. Faina knew that it would be futile even if there were 100 of her. They then passed by the huge crater. On the other side of the crater, Brando quickly found a canyon made entirely of black granite. This was not surprising. What he was concerned about was, there was actually a huge stone door in the middle of the canyon. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 441. Brando and Vahina arrived at a dark canyon. A majestic stone gate stood in the middle of the canyon. There was a 100-meter-tall stone statue erected on both sides of the gate. It was the long-bearded king of winter, Keldon, and the axe-wielding Kurd. They belonged to Cruz's god of war. Both of them stood at the foot of the statues. They were not even as tall as the statue's big toes and felt insignificant. Vahina looked up and saw a row of cuneiform words on the stone gate frowny face created by Darua for the final battle. "O stars in the sky, may you still shine upon the land 1,000 years later." The words were written in an ancient language that was mostly lost after the War of the Holy Saints. Thousands of years had passed since the Azure Knight broke open the sky and brought his spear to the earth in the Second Era. However, when they saw this stone tablet today, They could vaguely feel the weight of the history that had been passed down in the same vein. The stars will still shine upon the land 1,000 years later. You may rest in peace, Brando said softly as he looked at the stone tablet. Vahina looked at him blankly and did not say a word. The silence in the canyon was a little mysterious. The first thing he confirmed was that this was the entrance to Valhalla. This ruin was once a fortress built to fight against the Twilight Dragon, and it was supposed to be the place of the final battle. But like most of the other Holy Lands, Valhalla was destroyed in that terrible war, and only bits and pieces of history and legends were left to trace its location. Next was to contact the Druids according to their agreement. Brando had to use the space gem given to him by the Druids to transfer Sifrid over. She was the key to opening the gate. He walked under the giant door and used his gloves to sweep away a layer of dust on the ground to reveal the rock underneath. Then he took out Veronica's sword and drew a circle on the rock. He placed the 4 cyan gems on the circle's nodes. Next, he had to perfect the magic formation. Vahina found a rock and sat down. She could hear a deafening roar coming from the other side of the valley, and the entire valley seemed to be shaking slightly. She hugged her knees in fear. Hey WH, what are you doing? Getting down to business. If Endesha doesn't come here, don't disturb me even if the sky falls down. Brendel replied. That's right, I want you to keep a lookout for me. Vahina raised her eyebrows in surprise. This Erwin country bumpkin actually dared to order her around? You're not willing? Forget it then. Anyway, that woman is in a towering rage right now. She will definitely torture you before killing you. Brando carefully engraved the formation while describing it in a casual tone. All right. I heard that they like to cut off people's limbs and plant plants from hell on the cuts. Those plants are bloodthirsty. Have you seen them before? The young lady was so scared that her face turned pale. She pointed at Brando while trembling. You, how could you say such terrible things? Am I not telling the truth? Vahina's rose-like lips moved as if she was tongue-tied. It took a lot of effort for her to squeeze out a stubborn reply. I am just returning a favor since you saved my life. She then looked at the other side of the canyon in a fit of pique. Brendel was secretly amused. He had figured out that this young lady's temper was quite easy to deal with. She was indeed at Sundra. He pursed his lips and continued to complete the formation. Spatial magic was one of the most complicated formations in the world. Brando had repeatedly discussed the feasibility of this plan with the great Druid Elder before he carried it out. In the end, they decided to use a runic formation to determine the coordinates. The ones who actually cast the spell were the great Druids of the Withering Tree Council. The problem with this method was the coordinates of the spell and the conduction of the spell across tens of kilometers. The first problem was not difficult to solve. Brando himself knew alchemy, so drawing a runic formation was not a big problem. He memorized the runic formation scroll given to him by the great Druid Elder and did not even bring a sample of the runic formation with him. Green fragmented agate was used to conduct magic. This type of high-grade crystal was produced in the Mountain of Quelled Storms and had a rare resonance attribute. This attribute was actually a low-grade spatial phenomenon, and was used by wizards as a medium to conduct magic in many situations. However, no one could guarantee the success of a long-distance spell that was tens of kilometers long because the plan itself carried a certain degree of risk. The Druids were prepared to either succeed or die trying. They seemed to have placed all their hopes on this plan. Of course, Brando knew that the Druids had actually transferred a group of young and old Druids to the Withering Tree when the Calamity of Wolves began. This was to be the seed and inheritance left behind in case the resistance failed. That was why he pretended that he did not see it. However, Brando knew that this plan was not as dangerous as the Druids thought. In the game, players had also succeeded in long-distance spell transmission, and it was not just once. There were many successful examples in the later battles. What's more, the highest number of fragmented agates a player could use was 6. The lowest number of fragmented agates used was 1. In fact, an expert on the forum deduced that 4 fragmented agates was enough to guarantee a 97% success rate. The Druids provided a total of 12 fragmented agates, which was more than enough. However, Brando only planned to use 4 of them, and the rest would naturally fill his pockets. Fragmented agates were extremely rare, and if he missed this opportunity he might not be able to take advantage of it in the future. He set up the formation and pointed at the center of the formation with the tip of his sword. In the name of the storm and time, I beseech the Lord between the 3rd and 7th stars to let the mysterious power pass through the night sky. In the name of magic, Dallas Tyr. The young man's voice was so loud that it echoed in the valley. Dallas Tyr? Vahina was shocked. She turned around and saw the formation under Brando's sword suddenly emitting a misty green light. The green light flowed like liquid and filled every line of the runic formation. What kind of magic is this? Country bumpkin, you actually asked for help from the dragon of time and storm, Dallas Tier? That's a superior dragon. How could you cast such a high-level spell? It's a spatial spell, but I'm not the one who cast it. It's just a coordinate formation. Brando did not intend to hide anything this time. He looked up and saw 3 or 4 green lines streaking across the sky. Behind the clouds, the edge of the huge gear in the sky seemed to be turning. It was a sign that the laws were responding to magic. Spatial spell? But you're asking for help from the dragon of time and storm? Spatial spell. Spatial spell. Vahina suddenly could not remember what level of authorization one would need for spatial spells. She did not understand such a high-level domain at all. All spatial spells require authorization from the dragon of time and storm. Don't you know that? Brando turned around and glanced at her. Of course I know, I'm just asking. Vahina's face turned red. Vahina's face turned even redder. She angrily said, so why is that? Mistress, has no one ever told you that you have a bad temper? Brando shook his head and sighed. Time and space are one, it's just that they exist in different dimensions. What he was talking about was, in fact, a theory of the Silver School. The founder of the theory was William Pist, a master of spatial magic. It was said that no one had studied the void behind the world of Vaunt more intensely than he had. But just as Brando finished speaking, an old voice suddenly exclaimed, young man, where did you hear that from? Brando and Vahina were startled and turned around at the same time. But they could only see that the place where the voice came from was empty. Brando frowned and suddenly looked in that direction. Are you from the Silver Alliance? Why don't you show yourself? The old voice let out a series of hearty laughter. Young man, your reaction is fast. But your provocation won't work on an old man like me. Even though he said that, the old man still dispelled his invisibility spell and revealed himself. Brando narrowed his eyes when he saw the old man in a silver robe. William Pist, one of the 12 silver leaders of the Buga Magi. Some said he was 300 years old, while others said he was 400 years old. His legend was not only among the Buga Magi, but also among the commoners. There was even a poet named Kalgo who wrote a book called The Story of a Great Magus, sponsored by Kalgo and published by Bista. As for Bista, he was a rather famous merchant near Ampere Seal. According to the locals, merchants like him were always interested in doing strange things. Of course, it was because of this merchant's whimsy that the story of William Pist spread among the commoners. But when Brando looked at the old man, he couldn't help but think maliciously. Did he go to Kalgo to collect copyright fees or other related fees? When William saw Brando's eyes, he knew that the old man had recognized him. The old man couldn't help but show some surprise in his eyes. You recognize me? Many people know you, sir. One of the 12 silver circles, master of Kanaki, respected leader of the Magi? Brando replied. I didn't know I had so many titles, the old man smiled. But they've only heard of my name. Not many can recognize me. Let me think, you also know about the integration of space and time? William narrowed his eyes. This theory of the Silver School was created by him, but it was still immature and didn't receive much recognition. Even a few of his old friends didn't necessarily agree with his theory. He didn't expect to meet a young man who could casually say it out loud, and with a confident look on his face. This made him more and more interested. At this time, Faina finally reacted and realized who the person in front of her was. She looked at William in disbelief and was speechless for a moment. It seems like this little girl also recognizes this old bag of bones. What an honor. Brando couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. What is this old man doing here? He knew that the Magi from Buga were here, but he didn't know that the one who came was a leader of the Magi. This person's strength was probably on par with Endesha. Don't worry, William seemed to have seen through his worries and smiled. I'm just curious. Curious? To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 442. Curious. A small noble from the border who knows Ekis, the Alpha Wolf, knows Dalaster's spatial runic array, and even has the Sword of Earth and Mountains, a gift from the Dragon God. The sword in your hand is the Azure Firmament, right? The old man looked at Brando with his gray-green eyes and smiled wisely. Brando's heart skipped a beat. Can't a small noble have these? That's prejudiced. Sometimes you have to admit that prejudices are also an experience, William said with a smile. But it seems like these are your secrets. Forgive me for being rude. If I apologize to you, you won't make things difficult for an old man like me, right? Brando couldn't help but smile at William's witty words. At least William's amiable attitude was much better than the arrogant Cruz people. Theoretically speaking, as the leader of the Silver Folk, he had more reason to look down on the Iron Folk. But compared to the modesty and politeness of the wizards, the Cruz people were pathetic nouveau riche. Well, actually, I'm more concerned about this. The old man looked up at the majestic stone door and shook his head. Behind this door is definitely not the resting place of the Lionheart sword. Everyone guessed wrong. He turned around, his gray-green eyes flashing with a strange light. But if I'm not wrong, you know what's behind this door, right? Brando didn't believe that William came here out of curiosity, but he still asked, "Wizard, what's the basic principle of magic?" This question was as simple as eating and drinking to William. He answered without thinking, "It's the exchange of magic power and law. I've heard that the symbol of the Silver Union is a silver scale. Can you tell me the reason behind this, Sir Adept?" William's eyes flashed. "An exchange of equal value. Good boy, I understand. What do you want?" "Just do me a favor." "I understand. You want me to help you stop that woman, right?" The old man looked at the other side of the valley. "It's a little troublesome, but it's not out of the question." Brando nodded. He didn't doubt William's ability to guess his thoughts. The wizard leader's long life was not only wise, but also experienced enough to understand the truth of many things. The old man smiled. "It's a difficult deal, but I think it's worth it. Now, can you tell me what's behind this door?" "Valhalla," Brando answered. William was a little startled. "You mean the ruins of the goddess that the Druids talked about?" Brando nodded. He wasn't worried that the legendary wizard leader would meddle in this matter, because in most people's minds, Valhalla was a primitive flame. Obtaining this fire seed would immediately make one a lord of a region, but the attraction of this point was to stand on the side of power. It didn't mean much to a wizard at the top. Besides, Buga was an alliance of floating cities. The craftsmen of Buga didn't have any concept of territory, nor did they need it. Moreover, in the Camp of Order, this great wizard was on the same side as him. Legend has it that in the south of Erewhon, there's a primitive flame left behind by Martha. I've only heard rumors about it, but I didn't expect it to be in the center of the loop of trade winds. William looked at the majestic stone door and sighed. "Is it behind this door?" Brando nodded. "It's amazing." The old man turned his head. "But now I'm even more curious. This is a legend recorded in the secret texts of the Druids. How did you know about it?" Brando smiled but didn't answer. "I understand. Is this a secret?" Brando nodded. At the same time, in the Green Tower's Withering Tree Council, the Druids were bitterly waiting for the final moment to arrive. Outside the hall, lightning flashed and thunder roared. It was so frequent that it was as if it wasn't raining but thunder. Streaks of white lightning flashed through the rainy night, illuminating the faces of the Druids. The howling wolves had entered the upper levels of the Green Tower, and the battle was unfolding in the market area. The centaurs and tree elves had lost the market the night before, but they took it back at noon yesterday. Both sides had engaged in a battle of vines and branches for more than 10 hours. The Druids retreated because they didn't have enough soldiers. The wolves seemed to be endless. The hourglass in the center of the hall was turning for the last time. It would turn for about 4 hours each time, but to the Druids, these 4 hours were the longest of their lives. They still had one last chance, but the road to destruction was clear. Everyone was looking forward to it. A few elite Druids used thorny vines to block the roads leading to the city hall, but once the city hall fell, the Withering Tree Council would be the only place left for the Green Tower to defend. Ordinary civilians who had fled from other areas gathered anxiously in the few remaining open spaces in the last area of the city. Adults hugged their children and men comforted women. The air was filled with a suffocating tension and uneasiness. Only the sound of the rain could be heard. In the Withering Tree Council. At first, the Druids in the hall were still discussing, but when the young Druid beside the Great Elder turned the hourglass, the hall became eerily silent. Everyone seemed to have finished what they wanted to say or didn't know what to say. The discussion stopped. "In a few hours, if that young human doesn't send back news, the Green Tower's fire seed will be extinguished." A voice in the hall said. "Perhaps he's already dead." "I object. The fire seed is still shining." "That's fire seed, I recognize it." Everyone couldn't help but look behind the rain. In the darkness, there was only a faint green beam of light that pierced through the rain and into the clouds. But the beam of light hasn't moved for a long time. Perhaps they're in trouble. Even if they leave now, they won't be able to reach the center of the loop of trade winds in a few hours. The buzzing of discussion once again sounded, but because of this sentence, the uneasiness in everyone's heart seemed to have been pointed out. Even the stooped great elder frowned. But at this moment, a voice came from outside the hall. Perhaps that young human isn't dead yet. He's already here. Everyone turned around in surprise and saw a tall figure walking out of the rain. He took off his wet clothes and revealed a rugged face. It was the great druid Andrew, who had yet to return from the loop of storms. "Andrew, you're back? We thought you'd return to the embrace of the forest. When the calamity of wolves happened, I was behind the pass of wolves, so I escaped," Andrew replied. "When I realized that something was wrong, I turned into a raven and patrolled the forest. Only then did I realize that something had happened. I wasn't sure then, but now I can confirm that the young human isn't lying. This time the demonic wave is different." "Yes," the great elder nodded and looked at Andrew, "but you must have discovered something else since you've stayed in the forest until now." Andrew's sudden appearance brought confidence to everyone, but in such a situation, it was still not easy. They were eager to get something from the latter. They wanted to hear more good news, so they focused their attention on the great druid. Andrew nodded. "I wandered around the forest for a period of time to investigate the scale of the calamity of wolves. But I don't think I need to repeat myself. Everyone has seen it. It's just that I met Quinn in the forest and learned a few things from him." "You met that young human?" Everyone was shocked. "No, I said I met Quinn and saved a few human nobles along the way, but I didn't meet the Lord." "What's going on?" Someone immediately asked. "Aren't they together?" "They seem to have met with some trouble. The Lord has left alone and is heading to the center of the loop of trade winds." "Alone?" The great elder frowned. "Then are you sure he's already at the center of the loop of trade winds?" "No, I'm not," Andrew shrugged. "I came back to report the news because your guesses were wrong. There are a few descendants of Fenrir who have the ability to fly. If I didn't come back, I'm afraid I'd be in trouble." The hall fell silent. Descendants of the demonic wolves. The great elder's brows furrowed. "We have to prepare our defenses. If the demonic wolves with the ability to fly invade from the sky, the city hall's defenses will be in danger." Someone immediately reacted. However, his order did not receive any response. Everyone was more or less wavering. That young human was nowhere to be found. Was there any meaning in making a final struggle? It would be better to let those young humans with potential turn into ravens and fly away. There were not many descendants of Fenrir who could fly yet. At this moment, another voice came from outside the hall. "I wonder if everyone is still in the mood to meet a guest at this time?" "Guest? What guest would there be at this time?" Everyone was stunned. "If it's a guest, please come in." The great elder calmed himself down and spoke loudly. Tolman parted the curtain of rain and walked in. He held a silver staff with 6 runes revolving around it and smiled at everyone. The scholar stood there calmly as if the calamity of wolves did not exist. Perhaps, it made people feel that this person did not fit in with this world. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 443. After Tolman walked in, everyone fell silent. "A wizard from Buga?" "No, I'm here on behalf of Erwin," Tolman replied. "What do you mean?" The great elder frowned. "As long as the Witherwood Council survives, it's only a matter of time before the Green Tower is rebuilt. The mana wave is only temporary. A stable order can only be built after a long period of struggle and repeated failures." "Are you going to help us?" someone asked. Tolman shook his head and spoke bluntly. "Let's just say that Erwin needs a stable defensive line in the south. If the druids of the loop of trade winds are wiped out, the dark forest will spread to my homeland. Erwin can no longer afford to lose the south of Ampere Seal." "So you're going to stay and help us defend against the calamity of wolves?" "No, my abilities are limited. I can only take you with me," Tolman smiled. "I've already drawn the magic circle. It's in the inn where I'm staying. Of course, setting up a magic circle in the room without the owner's permission is a little rude. I'll apologize for that later. However, I'm afraid that I won't be able to do that. Now, what do you think of my suggestion? Leave?" Everyone fell silent. Leaving the Green Tower immediately meant giving up on it. Although it was only a matter of time before the Green Tower was rebuilt, they couldn't bear the thought of losing hundreds of years of hard work. How would they face the spirits of their ancestors if they did that? It would be better for them to die in this battle. It would be better for them to die in this battle. However, this Silver Union adept was right. Giving up now was not the same as giving up forever. As such, there were still some who were tempted. "How many people can you take with you?" the great elder asked calmly. 100, no more," Tolman replied. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. They were shocked by the great wizard's strength, but it also meant that other than these 100 people, the rest of them could only wait for death. If everyone could die, then there would be nothing to say. However, if some of them could survive, it would be too cruel. For others, it would be too cruel. Everyone had a reason to live. What right did the rest of them have to choose who they wanted to live on? The hall was so silent that one could hear a pin drop. Finally, someone made the final decision. "Let the young people leave. They are the hope of the future." Even though the Druids had sent away most of the elderly and children, they had left behind many talented youths. This was to ensure that the Green Tower's remaining forces would remain intact. Everyone knew that as long as the elites were transferred away, the city hall's defensive line would be riddled with holes like a leaky wall. Even so, Tolman still said, "Young people are not enough. They also need experienced people to guide them. You don't want them to repeat your past mistakes, do you? It's best if there are 1 or 2 elders in this team. That way the Green Tower can be rebuilt quickly." The hall fell silent again. Everyone looked at the great elder. However, the great elder said, "Let me remind you all. Don't forget that we have an agreement with that young lord from the human world." Everyone was stunned. They didn't expect the great elder to suddenly say such words. Only Andrew looked at the stooped old man who was much shorter than everyone else in the room with admiration. He slightly puffed out his chest as if he was infected by the words and felt a little proud. It was a kind of arrogance. The great elder's words represented the Druids' beliefs. Even though they were alone in the dark forest and were not known to outsiders, it was only to uphold the oath they had made 1,000 years ago. A true Druid would never forget their oath. When the golden bloodline was lost to the land, when the silver bloodline was lost, when the descendants of the 4 wise ones were corrupted, and when the land was plunged into the flames of war and pain, only the Druids would forever stand on the front lines to protect the order of the world because of their sacred oath with Martha. Because they would never lose their oath. "I also object." A crisp voice spoke up. Everyone turned around and saw a young girl with a tense expression standing in the middle of the crowd. "Sifrid, we have an agreement with Brother Brando and we must abide by it. If we abandon it today, then we will. One day we will also abandon everything that we have been holding on to." The hall fell silent for a moment. Tolman clapped his hands lightly. "Well said. Mr. Wizard, this doesn't seem to be in line with your position, does it?" Andrew questioned. "I stand on what I believe to be right," Tolman smiled, "but that does not stop me from appreciating other people's positions. Right and wrong are relative, but those who stand firm are worthy of my respect." "But then again, what will you choose now?" he continued to ask. "I will stay here." Sifrid was the first to speak up. Her expression was so resolute that it did not seem like a young girl's. "Why don't you listen to the opinions of the others first, little girl? You must be cautious when it comes to important matters." Tolman replied. "You know me? I've heard some rumors." The scholar did not mince her words. "But I'm only representing myself." Sifrid frowned. "But little girl, because of your position, your words will decide the fate of many people. Do you understand? That's too sly of you." Tolman smiled, but the Grand Elder stopped him from speaking. "Mr. Wizard, let's get back to the topic. Sifrid is still young, and it is not a bad thing for her to preserve her innocence and kindness." Tolman nodded. "So, what is the Grand Elder's answer to me?" The old man's back was hunched and he appeared to be hesitant. Sifrid stood beside him and pursed her lips tightly. She stared at Tolman as if he was an enemy. She instinctively felt that this mysterious old man's intentions were not good for her brother Brando. If the Druids gave up, then what about Hazen? What about her brother Brando in the forest? However, Tolman also blocked her words, making her unable to open her mouth. Most of the other Druids also kept their mouths shut and looked at the Grand Elder and the other Druids with inquiring eyes. Everyone's opinions were different, and even their hearts were wavering. On one hand, it was giving up on the possibility of the future. On the other hand, it was giving up on the promise. It was fine to keep the promise. But wouldn't it be pedantic to go against the will of the order for the sake of a promise? "Lady Martha, please enlighten us on what we should do." Many of them could not help but have such thoughts. At this moment, a bright flash of lightning streaked across the night sky, illuminating everyone's faces. At this moment, a trembling voice cried out, "The runestone is moving." Everyone's eyes turned to the center of the hall. There was a huge magic formation there, and the runestone at the center of the formation was suddenly activated. Green light flowed across the surface of the runestone, drawing out a mysterious pattern. Then the entire magic formation lit up. The druids and high-ranked druids around the formation began to channel their mana into the runestone. Storm in the sky, in the name of Dalistair, heed our call. Tolman was startled when he saw this scene. This is? The huge magic formation was already activated. Green light pierced through the clouds and intersected with the coordinates 100 miles away. Then, a blurry figure flashed across the magic formation. It was Brando. The scholar from Silverhold raised his eyebrows when he saw the young man. Then he saw Bran. William was even more surprised when he saw Brendel. Thank the heavens, it seems that Mother Marcia has not forgotten about this insignificant existence of mine. This magic formation can still be used. Brendel stood on the other side of the light, his voice was a little distorted, and the moment he spoke, people could not help but frown. What did he mean by, seems that Mother Marcia has not forgotten about this insignificant existence of mine? This magic formation can still be used? But his next words made the druids forget about their slight disrespect towards Lady Martha and their magic. Elders, I have good news for you. I have found the entrance to Valhalla. Next, I'll have to trouble you to send Siffred over. We're just one step away from victory. Everyone in the hall heaved a sigh of relief. Tolman raised an eyebrow when he heard about Valhalla. He wanted to say something, but William, who was standing behind Brando, signaled him with his eyes. The scholar smiled faintly and immediately shut his mouth. Only the Grand Elder was able to maintain his composure. He took a deep breath and asked, "About time. How long will it take?" "I'm not sure." Brando shook his head. "No one has tried it before, but I'm afraid it won't be easy to open the door." Even though it was expected, the druids still frowned. "You only have 4 hours, young man." At this moment, Tolman finally spoke. He looked at the others and asked, "In such a short time, can you guarantee that you can overcome all difficulties and save this city from the calamity of wolves?" "Of course, Brother Brando can." Siffred stood up and said. She could not tolerate Tolman questioning Brando in front of everyone. But Tolman did not care about the girl's words and only looked at Brendel. The latter was startled when he saw Tolman standing in the middle of the crowd. He was shocked and blurted out, "Grandmaster Tolman, why are you here?" Brendel suddenly realized something and immediately shut his mouth, but Tolman was already smiling with an "I understand" expression. "Looks like you've known me for a long time. Then I won't hold it against you about the little joke you played with me last time. Why don't you answer my question first?" Brando raised an eyebrow nonchalantly. He knew that Tolman would not really come looking for trouble with him. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 444. Grandmaster Tolman, are you asking this because you want to help Erwin? Brendel could not help but raise his eyebrows as he looked at the scholar who could be ranked in the top 3 in the Amber Sword. Very clever, but that's not the answer I want. Brando paused. I don't know, but I can only try. Brando shook his head. Do you have any suggestions, Grandmaster? I have a better suggestion. Tolman looked at Brando. Rather than placing our hopes in uncertain possibilities, why don't we choose a safer method? Don't you think so, young man? We don't have the right to put anyone in danger to gamble on a 1 in a million chance. I'll bet on gold, but you're betting on a person's life. Brother Brando won't do that. Siffred felt like she was about to explode from anger. Using bewitching words to sway people's hearts. That's just how you mysterious fellows do it. Even Vahina, who was on the other side of the light, could not help but snort. Of course she did not know who Tolman was. If she knew that Tolman was on equal footing with William in the Argent Society, she would not have dared to reprimand Tolman even if she was given 1,000 guts. In fact, even Vahina herself found it strange. She clearly wanted to stab Brando with her sword, but when she heard the old man's sinister words, she could not help but stand up and mock him. It was as if she subconsciously thought that she was on the same side as Brando. It was as if she was standing on the same side as him. But after she said that, she snorted softly as if to say, I just don't like that old man. I didn't expect you to speak up for me. Brendel teased her as if he was trying to make things difficult for her. Vahina's face turned red all the way to her neck. She wanted nothing more than to jump over and strangle Brando, but before she could do that, she reflexively retorted. He retorted, You, what nonsense are you spouting? It's not like that. Brando smiled but did not say anything. He turned around and looked at Tolman. Among so many people, he was the only one who truly understood the intention of the great scholar. He was indeed as calm and wise as he remembered, but he did not expect him to have such an idea. But it was understandable. Brando even thought it might be a mistake. There was a setting similar to insurance in the storyline. Even if the players failed the quest, the Withered Tree Council and the entire southern region of Erewhon could be preserved temporarily. Is this the so-called inertia of history? However, Brando smiled. What I want to save is lives, so I'm betting with lives. I'm putting myself in the most dangerous situation as the price. This is very fair. You're brave, but you can't expect everyone to be as brave as you. But I can ask for the treatment of the brave. Brando raised his head and answered without avoiding Tolman's gaze. Tolman paused for a moment, then smiled. The hall was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard. The young human lord's words were very clear, as if they were powerful and resonating. Those words could not help but feel ashamed. Only the great elder looked at Brando and nodded. The great scholar. Looking at his old friend William, the two of them exchanged a tacit glance. Interesting. All right, young man. You've convinced me. I'll give you some time. Tolman turned around and looked at all the druids in the hall. What about all of you? Now this little fellow has sent you an invitation. He said that only the brave can join this game. Now you can tell me what is your choice? The old man's voice echoed in the hall. Most of them answered the question with their eyes. Brando's ever-present confidence infected everyone. Even Vahina could not help but be startled. She looked at Brando's side profile and could not help but fall into a daze. This Erewhon country bumpkin does not seem to be so incompetent. At the very least he looks very handsome? In the Withering Tree Council, the great elder patted Sifrid's shoulder and everyone opened up a path for her. The druids standing beside the magic circle began to cast the spell. The light from the circle became more and more dazzling, and it was at this time that Tolman looked at William on the other side of the light. He suddenly spoke in his mind. Valhalla, it seems like you've discovered something incredible, old friend. He did not open his mouth, but the conversation between the two was completed on the mental level. It's not me. I'm just a bystander. William replied. But if we ignite the ancient fire seed, the Green Tower will indeed be preserved. Tolman said. You're wrong. Erewhon will obtain another territory because of this. You're saying that I should agree to this plan? Didn't you already agree to it? Not entirely. I hate that possibility. There's another reason, William smiled. The nine-headed phoenix once said that a man's wealth is his own ruin. Indeed. But why did you signal me to agree? Tolman asked. Did you see those druids? I can even hear them asking. The druids have never betrayed their oath. What about you, citizens of the Silver Empire? Tolman smiled faintly at William's ridicule. That's why I agreed. No matter what, we're on the same side of order. The humans are willing to fall, but the citizens of the Silver Empire cannot follow suit. The demon wave this time is already making me feel uneasy. I'm even starting to suspect the Dark Dragon. I'm afraid that the prophecy is not empty threats. Humans are willing to fall? I'm afraid that's not entirely the case. William looked at Brendel and smiled. But it's also nonsense to believe that the Dark Dragon will be resurrected. You and I should know best what kind of existence the Dark Dragon is. Tolman shook his head and did not refute William's words. But it seemed that he did not fully agree with William's words. At this time, Sifrid had already walked into the magic circle. After a dazzling white light, the runestone in the center of the magic circle suddenly exploded, and the druids around it fell to the ground. But this was the normal reaction of a magic circle. The runestone could not withstand the huge energy fluctuation caused by the teleportation and shattered. It was one of the main characteristics of magic formations that allowed the caster to bear the effects of the spell's backlash. Because of the huge magic reaction, the lights in the hall dimmed for a moment. Before anyone realized that the magic circle had succeeded, Andrew suddenly shouted, "All right. Hurry up and reinforce the city hall's defensive line. Don't let the descendants of Fenrir break in so easily." The druids who were dizzy from the explosion were startled for a moment, but they quickly reacted. The hall immediately became noisy as people ran around. The council was in a mess and they could not help but frown. But no matter what, the morale that was previously low due to pessimism and despair was now gone. It was as if everyone's courage had been ignited, and they longed for courage and glory. The great elder looked at this scene and could not help but hit the wooden staff in his hand with his finger. He let out a soft sigh. Unbelievable. Not only do the druids believe in a human from the outside world, but they are also inspired by a human. Tulman came to the great elder's side and said with a sigh, "A firm heart is universal. When people see that the strongest person has not fallen, they will also become strong." "But it's a pity." The great elder was slightly startled and turned his head. "It seems that wisdom cannot be transmitted. Otherwise that little guy would at least become smarter after seeing me. At least ask me to teleport that little girl over and not waste your limited strength." Tulman looked at the druids who had collapsed in the hall and said in a mocking tone. It could be seen that the high-grade druids had exhausted their mana. The great elder's expression suddenly became interesting. On the other side, Brendel caught Sifrid as she fell from the magic formation and sneezed loudly. He did not expect a great scholar to speak ill of him behind his back, and thought that it was either Seal or Romaine who had secretly pinned him with a scarecrow. Of course it was one of the two. The latter was more suspicious. He rubbed his nose and put Sifrid down. The little girl raised her head and stared at him with a face full of admiration. "You intend to let this little girl open the gate of Valhalla?" William looked at Sifrid and suddenly realized something. "So that's how it is. The daughter of the forest?" Brando nodded. "So the rumors are true. The fire seed of Valhalla is in the hands of the daughter of the forest, waiting for the day she awakens from her slumber. Today the prophecy has come true." No wonder Tumen suddenly said those words to me. William nodded in realization. "But you know how to open the door. Do you know the method?" Brando shook his head. Of course he did not. The guy did not mention this part at all. He thought that he could enter Valhalla with Sifrid, but he did not expect there to be another gate here. "I'm going to give it a try. It shouldn't be too difficult." Brando replied as he thought of the player in history. The great wizard raised an eyebrow. "I see. But I advise you to hurry up." The old man turned his head and looked at the other side of the valley. "That woman seems to have escaped from her troubles. I think it's your turn next." Brendel's expression changed, but he quickly replied, "I seem to remember that there's an agreement between us, Lord Wizard." William nodded with a faint smile. "Not only that, I can also give you an additional service." "What do you mean?" Brando was startled. "That is to tell you that there's more than one person here." "More than one person? What does that mean? There's someone else here?" Brando held Sifrid with one hand and was truly stunned this time. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 445. Brando did not expect Andesha to have a helper here. Even though the old man said that there were people on the other side of the fog who might not necessarily be on the tree herder's side, it did not mean that they were good people. In any case, this was not good news. "How much time do I have, Master William?" Brendel turned around and asked. The old man's wise gaze pierced through the fog and looked at the other side of the valley. He casually opened a dimensional hole in the air and took out a silver staff. "Andesha seems to have been frightened by Ekis, but she is still the lord of the tree herders. I believe that she will react quickly. You only have a few minutes?" Brando nodded. William's words meant that he did not have much time left, and he had to open the gate to Valhalla before Andesha reacted. He turned around and saw the gate of Valhalla standing between the valley and the valley. This man-made stone wall was so majestic that it was built by the great craftsman Darua and his many ancestors. The ancient black stone wall that had existed for 13,000 years seemed to have passed through the dust of history and laws. It quietly sat there and reappeared in their vision. Behind the pervasive fog, according to the epic, the gate was engraved with poems praising light and fire in many languages. At this moment, those strange words were engraved on the cold black wall, and the mysterious patterns looked like the sky that was hanging upside down. Gazing at the sky gave people the illusion that it would collapse at any moment, and it brought with it a suffocating pressure. The three of them slowly approached the giant gate and placed their hands on the carefully carved masterpiece. The cold stone responded with a power that shook their hearts, as if it was a breath of warmth left behind from thousands of years ago. Swords, spears, and halberds crisscrossed, and the sounds of battle filled the five senses. It was as if blood was smeared all over the place, dripping down from the black stone and the dry earth. Finally, the bell of destiny on the pendulum island rang, and a green pillar of light shot into the sky. The dragon spread its wings and blocked out the light of the sun. The darkness brought about the next era. Brando shook his head and suddenly woke up from the illusion. The heavy weight of history made it difficult for him to breathe. His forehead was glistening and cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He turned around and looked into the old man's silver-gray eyes. William smiled. Not everyone knows about this part of history. The azure night shattered the sky and brought us a new world. The twilight dragon fell to the earth and the long suffering ended, but people also lost their honor. The old man said with a smile. If this was in the game, Brando might have been interested in adding, the suffering did not end and people did not lose their honor. There is always oppression in this world, and heroes do not exist in people's imaginations. This was a standard answer to inspire the story. But Brando was not in the mood to discuss the legends of the past and the difficult times of the present with the leader of the Silver Alliance. He had long since passed the age of Chinibyu, and there was no need for him to be a hipster. Compared to that, the gleaming sword on his back made him feel more pressed for time. Especially now that the sword was in the hands of the enemy, and Andesha was closing in on him. Siffred, do you feel anything? He glanced at William pissed for a moment before turning back to Siffred. I feel a voice calling out to me, Brother Brando. Siffred closed her eyes and spoke nervously. Her fair hands were placed on the black stone, and the contrast was a little strong. What is it saying? The key to the door, the light of the stars, the heroic spirit of the ancient times, the guardian king. This is a sentence from the Druid's Thorn poem. Perhaps it's a code. Did the Druids teach you this? No, I only learned the nature's way. Brother Brando. That's all you learned in 3 months? I'm sorry, it's fine, it's not your fault. Even the Great Schism did not change these damned fellows' ability to waste time. Brando resisted the urge to curse. Perhaps their lifespans are too long, and they have learned the bad habits of the elves. You know a lot about the Druids and the elves? William asked calmly. This young man always surprised him. But Brando did not have time to answer him. He was trying to recall some information and strategies about Valhalla. Because it was too long ago, his memories were already blurry. He could only remember fragments, but he had to rely on these fragments to save his life. I don't know if this is it, Brando replied. You are the key to the door, Siffred. Tell it that you are the one who walks on the earth with the scepter of forests and mountains. You are the daughter of God who has given authority among the mortals. You are the chosen one who is favored by the ancient heroic spirits. Siffred stared at him with wide eyes. William also grabbed his silver goatee with one hand and narrowed his eyes as he watched this scene. Just repeat after me. Spirit of the door. Spirit of the gate. Siffred took a deep breath and chanted out loud, I am the one who walks the earth with the scepter of the forest and the mountains. I am the daughter of the gods, the chosen one blessed by the heroic spirits of the past. The two of them echoed each other. The little girl's voice was young, but it was filled with infinite power. So, the door suddenly rumbled and a loud voice came in response. The voice was like rolling thunder, piercing through the fog in everyone's heart. Siffred's eyes lit up. She looked at her brother Brando in disbelief. Brendel, it's speaking? Fina cried out in shock. William narrowed his eyes slightly. His silver eyes narrowed into a line. So? Siffred asked in confusion. So please open your door. Brando said. Please open your door. Siffred shouted. Her voice echoed in the valley, but this time the door did not budge. What's wrong? Fina asked. The conditions are wrong. Brando furrowed his brows. The words on the forums flashed through his mind like lightning, but the more nervous he was, the more blurry the words became. After all, that was almost 10 years ago. The old man turned his head around, and his subtle movement did not escape Fina's eyes. She became anxious. Hurry up, shut up, Brendel said in annoyance. You, Vahina glared at him, but she knew very well who was in charge here. Moreover, her life was in his hands, so she could only turn her head away and keep quiet. Brother Brando, the door is talking to me, Siffred suddenly said. What? Brando was surprised. What is it talking about? It's asking me where the sovereign is. Where is the sovereign? Brando's eyes lit up. He suddenly understood and placed his hand on the wall. So that's how it is. The sovereign is the only master of Valhalla, the ruler of the forest and the mountains. As the daughter of the forest, Siffred is the keeper of the scepter of the forest and the mountains. But one day the keeper will have to return the scepter to its master. The sovereign who wields the scepter rules over the vast lands beneath Valhalla and the Valhalla mountain, just like the legend described. Brando placed his hand on the wall and spoke in his mind, frowny face. O heroic spirits and sovereigns of the past, I am willing to take over your swords and protect this land. Let the darkness no longer cover the land, and let order break through the fog of chaos. If this is a responsibility, Please let me take over this heavy responsibility. If this is a crown of glory, please crown me personally. Because this light will break through the layers of clouds and sprinkle upon the land. It's just like what our ancestors saw in the dark wilderness. Even after 1,000 years, the sacred oath will still hold. He did not know why, but when he spoke these lines from the game, they felt as heavy as a mountain, as if 1,000 pounds were carved into his heart. The door remained silent for a moment. Then an old voice spoke, frowny face. I hope so, my successor. Brando and Sifrid felt an invisible force pushing them away from the door. They took a step back and looked up at the huge door. A faint noise came from within the huge door. It sounded like rolling thunder from the clouds. At first, it was so faint that it could not be heard, but it gradually grew louder and louder, turning into a boundless wave that rumbled together. The ground trembled. The broken pieces of stone trembled on the black ground, as if a clown was dancing on the obsidian ground, crazily waving its hands and feet, making cracking sounds. Vahina was so frightened that she bumped into a rock, but she did not notice it. Even the wizard leader William could not help but squint his eyes to witness this magnificent scene. The huge stone door slowly opened a crack. It was pitch black behind the crack, and a gust of wind blew out from within, causing everyone's hair to flutter. But the wind did not have the smell of dust and mold, only a heavy aura. It was the kind of heavy aura that came from between the stone walls and the dust. His surroundings quieted down. It was as if there was a terrifying monster hiding behind the door. Brendel sucked in a deep breath. We're not going in, are we? Brando? Vahina stammered as she stared at the dark space behind the crack. She stared at the door. When the door opened, it let out a long sound as if it came from the dark abyss. It completely destroyed her psychological defense, causing the girl's face to turn white. You don't have to go in. There might be a monster even more terrifying than Andesha inside. Brando said as he put away azure skies and unsheathed Haurangaya from his back. While you're scaring me, I won't be scared. Vahina was on the verge of tears. Brando glanced at her and patted Sifrid's shoulder, then brought her into the room. Grandmaster William? Vahina looked at Brando as he walked into the room and turned back pitifully. Little girl, your lord is right. No one knows what kind of dangers lie in the ancient ruins. You might think that the danger you faced before was a kind of mercy. He's not my lord. Oh, that's right. If that's the case, then you don't have to worry about his safety. The old wizard smiled and raised his staff, preparing to enter the room. The noble lady's face turned red and white, but she could only grit her teeth and follow after Brendel and the old mage, one after the other, walked into the room. She did not know if Brando was trying to scare her, but the hidden threat was nothing compared to the real danger. It was common knowledge that humans were smart creatures. Besides, the old man is right. Even though he's not related to me, he did save my life. I can't just leave him like that. At least, my pride as a Cruz will not allow me to do so. Why, you're right. Vahina only needed a second to convince herself. To be continued. If you like this novel, you're welcome to vote for it at Chidian.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 446. Scarlet. The soft call seemed to be lower than the howling wind outside. The red-haired girl looked up. Veronica was sitting not far from her. The two hid in the natural shelter formed by the recessed black rocks. This kind of terrain was not uncommon in this area that was shrouded in wind and sand all year round. Veronica seemed to want to break the silence, but she did not know where to start. The girl in front of her had a strong sense of wariness towards her. It was not Scarlet's fault. After all, they were enemies before. But the female Legion commander chose to speak in the end. Scarlet blinked her beautiful amber eyes and looked at the noble woman from the Cruz Empire with doubts. The relationship between the two seemed to have changed from hostility to a subtle relationship of mutual dependence. She could not help but feel that it was unreal. Of course, more than that, she was uneasy. This uneasiness did not come from the fear and nervousness of her situation, but from the concern of leaving the Lord. The uneasiness was reflected in the girl's expression through the subtle refraction of her expression. Her eyebrows were slightly wrinkled, and her eyes were full of worry. Veronica sighed. You don't have to worry too much. Your lord will be safe. The comforting words more or less made the girl relax a little. At least her hands were no longer clenched into fists. Then the female Legion commander showed a kind smile. There is a saying in the Cruz army. A young man with a tough life is favored by the stars in the sky. It is said that a child who came to this world on a certain night when the bright galaxy stretched across the sky is the child of the stars. The child of the stars is favored by luck and can always turn misfortune into blessings. I think he has the potential. Scarlet did not understand why Veronica suddenly said this to her. She stared at the female senior in disbelief as if questioning, is there really such a legend in the crew's army? The distance between the two was shortened a lot. Where are you from? Veronica suddenly asked. Scarlet whispered the word I, and suddenly became alert. She looked at the lady with suspicion in her eyes. But the latter shook her head and could not help but laugh softly. You don't have to be nervous. I'm just curious. She tilted her head and looked at her in confusion. Veronica shook her head. Even though she was already over 100 years old, the goddess of war still retained her youthful vigor. It would not be an exaggeration to say that she was a stunning beauty. However, at this moment she sat on the sand looking a little tired. If there is only one genius in 100 people, then your liege must be someone who only appears once in 1,000 years. Actually, I don't doubt his future achievements, but I'm just curious. Can such a person really appear in the border province of a small country? Brando said that he's a small lord at the border of Erewhon, but I feel that this story is too legendary. It's just like those night novels. Veronica turned around, her green eyes flashing with a wise smile. But everyone knows that stories are just stories. She stared at her blankly. I don't mean any harm. I'm just curious. I don't know. The girl lowered her head and shook it. Veronica seemed to be trying to discern the truth from Qianxi's expression, but she did not press on. It was as if this conversation was just a casual conversation. She only nodded. That little girl knew him before you. Qianxi did not know why, but she knew that Veronica was referring to Amandina. She nodded. What a mysterious little girl. Veronica licked her lips subconsciously. This habitual action was like 20 or 30 years ago when she met an opponent who she did not want to admit defeat on the battlefield. Her green eyes flashed with a wild light. She looked back. Are you still worried? Qianxi shook her head. She did not want to show her cowardice in front of outsiders. Veronica smiled. Let's wait for the wind and sand to die down a little. We'll go down and find him. The red-haired girl swung her ponytail and looked at her in surprise. Veronica did not say much. In fact, she rarely showed her friendly side in front of others, but this lonely girl touched a soft spot in her heart. It reminded her of when she was young. Veronica watched Qianxi's reaction carefully and felt a little amused. But it was at this time that a sudden sound came from the sandstorm outside. A piece of stone slid down the mountain wall in the wind, as if someone was walking between the cliffs. The sound of footsteps startled the two girls. Veronica subconsciously reached for the sword at her waist, but when she grabbed the air, she remembered that she had already given the azure skies to Brando. She only had time to raise her head and hear the footsteps outside getting closer and closer. Then a voice asked in the sandstorm outside, "Are there other travelers inside? Can you let me in to take shelter from the wind? This weather is really unfriendly." Veronica raised her eyebrows slightly when she heard the voice. "Please come in, Count." The lady hesitated for a moment before replying. Hearing this answer, the person outside the cave was slightly stunned. The other party seemed to be taken aback, but immediately rushed in. The light in the cave dimmed slightly. The person who came in pressed a hand on his sword and looked down at Veronica from the entrance of the cave. "Veronica." A familiar face greeted Qianxi's eyes. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. After entering the giant obsidian door that guarded Valhalla, it was as if they had entered a vast underground space. The entire space was immersed in endless, silent darkness. Brando and the others walked for a while in the absence of light, and their vision gradually adapted to the environment. They gradually found themselves walking up a cylindrical bridge, and there were many similar bridges around them. They were bunched up and formed a not steep slope. There were no handrails around these bridges, which sounded a little dangerous. But in fact, these cylindrical bridges were dozens of meters wide, and walking on them was still considered stable. It was just that when he looked back occasionally, the pillars behind him were inserted into the endless darkness below as if there was no end. When he raised his head, the top of the pillars also extended forward endlessly, drowning in the darkness. This visual illusion made them think that they were ascending vertically, as if they were walking between heaven and earth before the creation of chaos, and if they were not careful they would lose their footing and fall into an endless abyss. Anyone who looked at such an environment would feel their limbs go weak, let alone a certain person in the group. Brando did not walk for long before he felt another hand holding his other than Sifrid's. He turned around and saw Faina, who was trembling in fear, standing beside him with a pale face. She looked at him pitifully as if telling him not to make a sound. But Brando snickered inwardly. There was no way William did not notice her actions, and Sifrid's ears were also very sensitive. In other words, she was just deceiving herself. Even the torch can't be lit? Brando asked in the darkness. The eternal torch is useless, and magic is also ineffective. Perhaps there is a magic suppression. The old wizard stood beside him as if he was talking about something unrelated to him, but you can try a higher level spell. For example, an artificial sun. Forget it. Brando was very clear about that spell and he did not want to blow up this place. However, the darkness was not much of a threat to them, and he was more concerned about the enemy behind them. The young man turned around and looked at the place where he came from. Andesha and her helpers were circling around the place. It was the effect of William's spell. This great wizard indeed had the power to match his reputation, and no one dared to say that they could easily trap Andesha. The old wizard noticed Brando's expression and could not help but smile. He stroked the tip of his staff and said proudly, "This labyrinth spell should be able to trap them for a while, but I can't help you anymore, young man." It was Brendel's idea to set up an ambush behind Valhalla's gate. Even William did not know Andesha's personality, but Brendel was different. He knew that Andesha would definitely be at a disadvantage in this ambush. However, the plan was somewhat different from what he had originally envisioned. If I remember correctly, the Tree Herders and the Silver Alliance are enemies, right? Brando could not help but raise his head and ask, wouldn't it be better to take this opportunity to get rid of them? He looked at the great wizard eagerly, hoping that he would make a move so that he could get rid of them once and for all. You're dreaming. The old wizard laughed. Actually, I'd like to, but the opponent is one of the 12 Tree Herders. Although I don't know how you managed to provoke such a person, the chances of winning against this woman are too low, so I won't make a move easily. Brando secretly glanced at the old wizard, thinking that this was really in line with the temperament of these craftsman wizards, quantifying the chances of winning a battle. It was no wonder that they had never really lost in any conflict. No matter what, the silver folk were monsters. However, he did not intend to persuade William so easily. He more or less retained some of the game's thinking, and at least in the Amber Sword he would not blatantly give the players a chance to cheat. Even if it's a sneak attack? No. William shook his head. All right, young man, don't think too much. This maze spell can trap Andesha for at least half an hour because she doesn't know that I'm here. If she sees me, this spell won't work. And even if this condition doesn't exist, she will discover that it's an illusion sooner or later. This is the first reason. The old wizard raised a finger. The second reason is that I can't stay here with you for too long. You're leaving? Brendel was taken aback. The Archmage was currently his biggest backer, and he did not expect him to leave so soon after coming here. The Green Tower is about to fall. You don't want your efforts to go to waste, do you? William scratched his head that was full of silver hair. To be honest, Brendel found it hard to believe that a respected wizard leader would do such a nonsensical action. All right, the old man said, actually, this has nothing to do with me, but since Tulman asked for my help, I can't refuse. The Green Tower is about to fall so soon? Brando did not know that he had been unconscious for several days. He thought that there were no players participating in the Maze of Wolves. Fortunately, the leader of the Adepts of the Silver Union was here. This was a relief to him. If William took action, the calamity of wolves would not be able to threaten the druids for the time being. But no matter what, he did not have much time left. The old wizard patted his shoulder and passed a box to him. This is a gift from me, young man. There's a cloak in the box that will allow you to avoid Andesha's detection. Wait, Brando shouted. There are 3 of us, Grandmaster. I know, the old wizard smiled. That's why this cloak is used by the giants. Used by the giants? Brando had a strange expression on his face. What kind of strange setting was this? That's right, but it has a flaw. It can only be used once a day. After that, it's no different from a normal cloak. Do all Magi's items have such strange temperaments? Brando took the box and asked in annoyance. Everything that was happening right now reminded him of his experience in the game. He did not have a good impression of Magi's creations. Oh, it seems like you're quite familiar with them. I'm relieved. The old wizard smiled and waved his staff in the air, opening a silver door of light. But don't underestimate this cloak. When it's in effect, even the Dragon King will not be able to break through its concealment. Dragon King? You mean Bahamut? Brando was stunned. He could not help but look at the box in disbelief. But whether it was the Fire Dragon King Bahamut or the War Dragon Tiamat, if this cloak was as the old wizard had said, then it was at least a mythical item. But was a mythical item like this? Brando turned around and saw the old wizard walk into the door of light. But in the end, William suddenly turned around and said to him in a serious tone, "Young man, I'll leave you with the time. The rest is up to you. Wait, I'll say." Brando suddenly reacted, "You haven't told me what the activation incantation is." It was a pity that William didn't hear his last sentence. The door of light flashed in the darkness and then disappeared as if it had never existed. What the heck? At that moment, Brendel felt like he was being cheated. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for it at Cheedian.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 447. The silver door disappeared without a trace as if it had never existed. Brendel held the box in his hand and was at a loss for what to do. Vahina giggled as she looked at the young man. "Is it that funny?" Brando asked in annoyance as he opened the box. "TSK. What can you do if I want to laugh?" "Yeah, I don't even know whose claw this is." Brando shook his head and sighed as he looked at his left hand. The princess of flower and leaf collar flung her hand away at lightning speed. Her pink neck was dyed with a layer of red. You, how could you say that? Did I promise you anything?" Vahina clenched her fists as she glared at Brando. Her eyes were spitting fire as if she wanted to eat him alive. Vahina stomped her foot and scolded, "Just you wait, I'll complain to Lady Veronica." "Complain? Say what?" Vahina was stunned. She blushed and stuttered, I'll say that you took advantage of me." This woman? Brando stared at Vahina with his mouth agape. He never thought that she would do something like that. It felt like he was punched in the face and it took him a while to recover. "You're really going to say that?" "Of course not. I'm lying." Vahina snorted softly, "It's not like I'll get anything out of it. Besides, it's embarrassing to be taken advantage of by a country bumpkin." Brando was speechless. But if this brainless woman with no breasts really went to the Duke of Flowerleaf and said something she shouldn't say, he was afraid that the Duke would send the Kurlutz Empire's Pegasus Knights to arrest him and bring him to justice. But he almost forgot about the box in his hand due to the argument between the two. Speaking of the box in his hand, Brando quickly realized that the box in his hand seemed to be a magic item. He pulled out a long cloak from the box like a curtain, and the corners of the cloak kept coming out of the box. In the end, the cloak was several times bigger than the box in his hand. But no matter how magical this cloak was, if there was no activation spell, it was really no different from a curtain. It was even worse than a curtain because at least the curtain had beautiful patterns on it that could block the sun. Brando shook the cloak. He could only treat it as a large piece of cloth. It would be a pity to throw it away, but he also felt that it was too heavy. He realized that William had given him a difficult problem. After some consideration, he wrapped the cloak around his hand and continued to walk forward. This underground passage shouldn't be too long. He remembered that the player had mentioned in his post that the player had walked in the dark for more than 10 minutes. Just as he was about to give up and return to the city, he suddenly entered the center of the loop of trade winds. In that case it should be the same here. He raised his head and looked up. The vase-like bridge seemed to converge at a certain point above. The higher he went, the more obvious he could feel this. Brando silently calculated the time. He was holding Sifrid's hand and Faina was right behind him. Their footsteps were exceptionally clear in the darkness and silence. The rustling of the footsteps did not sound like footsteps on the ground, but rather like some kind of sneaky shadow following behind them. It was a chilling sight to behold. Faina turned her head several times to look behind her, but it was pitch black. She wanted to follow Brando closely, but when she thought of Brando's repulsive appearance, she could not help but fall back a few steps to avoid being ridiculed. After about half an hour, Brando felt the air around him begin to move. This made him feel that the player's strategy was a little too deceitful. But when he thought about it again, it was not easy to keep track of time in the dark. It was inevitable that there would be mistakes, so he felt at ease. After a few more minutes, another stone door appeared in front of him. This door opened upwards at a slanted angle from the ground. The mysterious and historical patterns on the door were immersed in the darkness, like a piece of history buried deep under the dust. But this door was much smaller than the one below. It was only a tenth the size of the one below. Brendel thought that he would need to open the door again, but when they got close to it, the door creaked on its own, and the dust that was constantly falling off the door sank in. Instead of saying that the door sank in, it was more like the door was opening bit by bit. Brendel could not help but be slightly surprised. He did not expect the door to have its own senses, and thought that it was quite advanced. But when the door opened, the scenery behind it left him speechless. Even Faina and Sifrid behind him could not help but widen their eyes in shock. At first, a ray of light poured out from behind the door. This was the first time they had come into contact with sunlight after entering the Evernight world. The gentle white light poured in like water from the door, seeping in through every opening and turning into spots of light that fell on their faces. Then the gap between the door grew bigger and bigger and more light appeared. The beams of light were like sharp swords that cut through the darkness. The sharp swords pierced through the darkness and caused it to fall apart. The white light engulfed the three of them like a tide. Brando, Faina, and Sifrid could not help but squint their eyes. However, when their eyes adjusted to the bright environment again, the scenery behind them suddenly captured everyone's hearts. The loop of trade winds was located at the center of the Kalanga Mountains, the center of the storm. Brendel had imagined the peaceful area in the eye of the storm more than once. But just as he imagined, this place was a basin surrounded by mountains. The undulating peaks were the same as the ones he saw at the Wolf's Pass and the Wall of Roses. The only difference was that the scenery here was much more beautiful. Looking from afar, the distant view was the circulation of the atmosphere surrounding the mountains. The surrounding storm formed a wall hundreds of meters high above the mountains. For hundreds of years, no one had passed through the invisible wall of atmosphere to enter this place. Brando could only confirm that they had entered the heart of the loop of trade winds when he saw the raging winds in the sky. He raised his head and saw a thick layer of clouds in the middle of the sky. Golden light shone from the edges of the clouds, and the sun shone down on the vast land. It was as if the darkness and storm outside the loop of trade winds, as well as the berserk mana tide, didn't exist. It was peaceful here. Flocks of birds could be seen in the distance, as if it was a scene from a mythological tale. But Brando's attention was immediately attracted by another thing. It was a giant tree in the middle of the basin. In fact, he was not even sure if it was a tree. He had to look up to see the full picture of the giant tree. The crown of the tree almost covered half the sky. The huge trunk pierced through the clouds, and the huge roots under the trunk occupied almost the entire basin. Its roots were deeply rooted in the ground and it was covered with layers of moss. From afar it looked like a green mountain range. Brendel sucked in a cold breath. This was the World Tree. Legend has it that in ancient times, the Druids also owned a golden oak tree that was as large as heaven and earth. At that time, the Ring of the Sky was still called the Ring of the World. They lived around this tree for generations. But after the collapse of Babel Tower, the World Tree was also destroyed in the war. The Druids split up, and today's Loop of the Sky and Tree Herders were formed. However, there was no record of another World Tree in this world. Brendel's jaw dropped as he stared at the giant tree. It was not as glorious as described in the legends but more like nature. Green moss and forests covered the roots and trunk of the giant tree with a layer of verdant green. It was a vibrant green. Clouds curled around the trunk of the giant tree, and there were flashes of lightning flashing through them. This can't be the World Tree in Norse mythology, right? Brando muttered to himself. Is this the World Tree in the legends, Brother Brando? Sifrid asked with a light sigh. Brando nodded. He suddenly thought of the cylindrical bridges that they crossed. Perhaps they were not bridges at all, but the roots of the World Tree that were inserted into the ground. The thinnest roots were at least 100 meters in diameter. Oh, Martha! Brendel took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the emerald green forest. Large flocks of birds flew above the canopy, but the entire forest was silent, and there was not a single trace of human activity. This is Valhalla? Brando suddenly understood what was going on. In the game, Valhalla was destroyed in a fire. Although it was a little ridiculous to say that the World Tree would be destroyed in a fire, it made sense that such a forest would fall into a sea of fire. Be Brando? The stuttering voice belonged to Vahina. The noble lady was so shocked that she almost bit her tongue. She even secretly pulled at her cheeks to confirm that she was not dreaming. What is it now? Brando turned around. Look at that tree. Vahina raised her hand and pointed at it. Brando looked up and was slightly startled. He was so shocked that he did not notice that the World Tree's canopy above the clouds had no leaves. A withered World Tree? He could not help but exclaim. No, not that. Vahina replied, there's something below. What else is there? Brando looked down but he could not move his gaze away. It was as if his eyes were rooted to the center of the World Tree. There was a circle of man-made buildings around the trunk of the World Tree. Or rather, it was an extremely huge palace. It was surrounded by clouds and lightning, as if it was the residence of the ancient gods. Even from such a distance, one could feel the majesty and magnificence of this building. Valhalla. Brando blurted out. What is that? Vahina did not understand. But just as she was about to ask her question, Brendel suddenly heard another exclamation from the forest not far away. Chaos above, the world tree. It was Andesha's hoarse voice. Both of their expressions changed. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 448. Brando immediately turned around and placed his index finger on his lips, gesturing for Faina and Sifred to keep quiet. Andesha's voice caused Faina's face to turn pale. She almost screamed out loud, but when she saw Brando's action, she covered her mouth and calmed herself down. The forest became quiet once more. Not far away, there was a certain Pteroptera making a monotonous noise in the bushes. A few small rodents were also making rustling noises as they darted through the weeds. Faina could almost hear her own pulse beating vigorously in this strange silence. Her blood was pumping faster due to her nervousness, but her fingers and face were turning paler. What should we do? She mouthed the question. Her arrogance seemed to have disappeared without a trace, leaving behind an ordinary girl who looked at Brando with fear in her eyes. She realized that he was the only person she could rely on right now. Brando glanced at her. At this moment, the noble lady's face was as dirty as a cat's, and her beautiful blonde ponytail was also covered in dust. Although anyone would be like this after the previous battle, he still felt that she was much cuter than before. At the very least, the arrogant and domineering attitude she had when she bickered with him was long gone. Don't worry. Brendel mouthed the same reply. Brando knew that her current attitude was only temporary. She was still the daughter of the Duke of Cruz, and her arrogance was engraved in her bones. She was still bickering with him before Andesha appeared. He calmed himself down and listened carefully. There were faint footsteps coming from the other side of the forest. Andesha did not seem to have any intention of hiding herself, and there was no need for her to do so with her strength. She would only hide herself out of fear, and a true expert would not do so. Just like how they were doing right now. Back in the game, I didn't have many opportunities to use stealth as a level 130 warrior. The time I learned the skills of a rogue was a memory from many years ago. That experience was exciting, but it was different now. Running for his life in the real world meant that his life was in constant danger, and the feeling of having a knife at his back was not exciting at all. Instead, he felt nervous and scared to death. Brando was not used to such a difference, but because of his past experience, he was able to calm down quickly. He stood motionless and heard two footsteps, one after the other, hesitating not far to the west. That direction was quite close, which meant that there might be more than one exit to the surface. However, could this be considered a form of luck? Then he heard Andesha's voice. That brat might have already left. I didn't think that there would be people from the Silver Alliance protecting them in secret apart from the druids. That spell from before had a familiar aura. I wonder if it was one of those old guys. Hearing this voice, Brando couldn't help but hold his breath subconsciously. But immediately, another man's voice sounded familiar. I didn't expect a monster like you to regret making so many enemies. Isn't this a form of mockery? Making too many enemies? What a joke. Andesha's voice was slightly shrill, and Brendel could hear that she was sneering. I can understand why you cowards are afraid of the slightest thing. But if that's the case, why don't you cowards just go back to your filthy nest? All right, the man's voice softened. I'm not here to quarrel with you, Andesha. Compared to that, I'm more curious about the existence of another world. I don't doubt that we are the first batch of visitors to this place after thousands of years. It's the second batch. Don't forget they might have already entered. Brando knew that the they Andesha was referring to was him. She probably didn't dare to confirm how many people were with him, and if she had doubts, she would have scruples. This was good news for him. It doesn't matter, Andesha. Did you notice that the young man knew about this place from the start? I don't believe that he would open that door without any preparation. The man continued, even though the door outside is the legacy of the foolish humans, you have to admit that in the golden era, these things are magnificent compared to the pitiful civilizations of the present. Do you think, Andesha, that such an existence would open the door without any warning? What are you trying to say, Mihala? Oh, I forgot that you should be called. Andesha retorted with a frivolous tone, but the man interrupted her before she could finish. Andesha, don't you care about what the druids are secretly preparing behind everyone's backs? Not to mention that those old fogies from the Silver Alliance are also involved. There are fragments of the sealing stone here, and there might be something even more shocking. Something even more shocking? Isn't this world tree enough? This withered world tree is probably an experimental product of the ancient war, but it's nothing. You know that very well, Andesha. Perhaps, but I also want to know. That's why you should stop talking nonsense and come with me. Your personality hasn't changed at all. The man replied. The two of them stopped talking and Brando immediately held his breath. He knew that Andesha's perception was frighteningly high, and it meant that they would be discovered if they were the slightest bit careless. Andesha didn't even need to focus her attention to do so. Faina also understood this point. Even though she was a little arrogant, she was still quite knowledgeable. As someone from the upper class of the Cruz Empire, she had seen all kinds of experts and knew how terrifying Andesha was. The last one was Sifrit. She was a cautious and quick-witted girl from the mountains. She only needed to see her brother Brando's choice to know what to do. She raised her head, her large green eyes darting around, but she didn't make a single sound. The three of them stood there like puppets and they heard footsteps from the other side of the bushes. It seemed like Andesha and the man called Mihara were looking for directions. They might have entered the center of the forest, Andesha said, and the footsteps gradually moved away from the world tree. After a long time, Brando finally let out a sigh of relief. Phew! Faina let out a long sigh and patted her chest with a pale face. She looked like she had just been fished out of the water. Her back was drenched in sweat, and her forehead was also covered in cold sweat. Great, they're far away. Let's use this chance to turn back. She immediately said. Turn back. Of course. That woman thinks that we've entered the forest. Before she can react, we should meet up with Lady Veronica and leave this place as soon as possible, right? Faina's eyes widened as she spoke. No, you're mistaken about one thing, Brando shook his head solemnly. You should be the one to turn back, my lady. That's fine too. Ekis is still sleeping outside and won't be waking up anytime soon. Andesha has also defeated the nightmare, so there shouldn't be any danger on the way back. You should remember the way back, right? Faina was stunned and her eyebrows rose sharply. Why you want me to go back alone? What else do you want? Why you're not going to accompany me? Faina asked in disbelief. Brando was a little confused. Just how natural was it for her to ask him to accompany her back? Could it be that they were familiar with each other? Why should I accompany you? He naturally rejected her request. You. Faina's face turned green and white as she looked at him. She was about to throw a tantrum, but for some reason she calmed down halfway. Then why are you staying here? There's such a big tree there. Anyone would be curious about it, my lady. Brando naturally wouldn't tell her the truth and simply pointed at the world tree. Of course, anyone with a normal mind could hear the perfunctory tone in his words. Hey, curiosity isn't as important as your life? Brando was surprised and asked curiously, are you worried about me or are you worried that no one will accompany you back? Faina's face flushed red. She raised her eyebrows and shouted, none of them, you idiot. I'm just asking, I don't care about your life. Then I'm leaving. Don't blame me if you die. After saying that, she took a deep breath and turned to leave. Brando looked at her back and shrugged. He was more serious than her. Even though it was a little out of his expectations, he had no choice but to stay and fight with Andesha for the right to rule Valhalla. It sounded inconceivable, but it wasn't unrealistic. Andesha did not know the true meaning of this place and did not have a clear goal like him. Brando had already taken the initiative. Secondly, he was together with Sifrit, and Valhalla had already acknowledged him as its sovereign. If he could obtain control of this legendary territory, he could use the power of this place to defeat Andesha. It was like a god having a huge advantage in his own divine kingdom. Even though it was a little exaggerated to say that. But according to Brando's knowledge, it was enough for Valhalla's sleeping guards to chase Andesha away. Even though it was unrealistic to keep Andesha in this place. However, while these possibilities sounded simple in theory, they were actually extremely dangerous in practice. Especially to seize the initiative under Andesha's nose. Just the thought of it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Brando was not interested in bringing a burden along with him when he made such a desperate gamble. He was more than willing to find an opportunity to send Faina away. In fact, he was more willing to send Sifrit to a safe place. Only a lone ranger would be able to walk safely on the edge of danger. But what Brando did not expect was that just as Faina's figure disappeared behind the door and he heaved a sigh of relief, Faina walked out from the door again. Hey! She was obviously scared to death in the dark and her face was unbelievably pale, but the first thing she said was, Right, I suddenly remembered that the people of Kurlutz don't don't have the habit of abandoning their companions. Although we were enemies before, after all, you saved me once. You may be heartless, but I can't be unrighteous. Brando's face darkened. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 449. The forest was very quiet. Brando pushed aside the overgrown vines and barely heard any sound as he moved through the forest. Even the birds rarely flew over their heads. Looking ahead from where he was now, behind the layers of leaves was an open basin in the distance. The dense forest was like a dazzling jasper lying in the middle of the mountains. The terrain gradually lowered towards the center, forming a depression. Looking further, there was a magnificent tree in the center of the basin. The tree's roots spread out in all directions, forming a mountain range. The nearest route extended less than a mile in this direction. Andesha and her companions should have already arrived there. He did not dare to get too close. After all, the Lord of Withering was a half-druid, and had many advantages in any forest. He led the two women along a small path. Traces of the path's existence could be vaguely seen in the grass, although it had long been lost in the passage of time. However, the artificially carved slate fragments scattered in the dense forest silently told the story of the past. Brando looked up. Now, only the dense aerial roots hanging down from the towering trees and the dense bushes under his feet were left. The gray-green plants clung to the waxy white rocks on both sides of the path. Only occasionally, through the gaps between the roots, could he see traces of what looked like words on the flat surface of the rocks. However, they had long eroded away. If Brando's guess was correct, those words should belong to the Silver Folk. Of course, it was not the ancient Elven language or the wizard language. The people who lived in Valhalla in ancient times should have long been lost in the long river of time. There was not a single word that mentioned who they were. However, Brando guessed that the Silver Folk might have an inseparable relationship with the children of the forest. Today, Erwin's entire southern territory had their legacy. But for some reason, even the Silver Elves did not have any description of Valhalla's past. In fact, the Silver Elves and Valhalla seemed to have the same origin. Brando had asked the Silver Elf princess, but the answer he received was not beyond what he knew. Medisha once said that Valhalla should be much older than the Silver Elves. The Silver Elves, Mist Elves and Moon Elves, the three silver bloodlines and their common elven court, Alfheim, appeared in the era dominated by the Dark Dragon after the World Tree split. Valhalla was already a legend even before the Dusk War. In the current Wound, the Twilight Dragon had long been an illusory symbol. Most ordinary people knew about this great demon, but they also knew that it was already dead. The story that happened in the myth, only the monks and players of the Holy Cathedral knew a little about the forces of chaos. But in comparison, they only had to deal with the cultists who acted in the name of Dusk. Not to mention the war of heaven and earth in the Sacred Covenant, even the war of the Holy Saints with the darkness was a distant history. Not to mention the legends that existed in the same era as the Twilight Dragon, such as Valhalla, the Azure Knight, and the Blue Epic, which had long become ballads and stories of bards. If I'm not mistaken, those are words, right? Vahina asked softly behind him. Ever since this noble daughter did not dare to go back alone, she simply relied on Brando. She could see that although Brando was not like the other noble youths who were subservient to her and did not always get along with her, at least he would not really do anything to her. Can't you see for yourself? Brando replied in annoyance. But I remember that the last time the people of Erwin opened up the wilderness was 53 years ago. It was Baron Rumman from the House of Viro, and he was also the last pioneer knight of Erwin. The book said that before that, the land south of Randner was a true dark forest, a land without a master, and no civilization had ever owned this place. But if these are really words and prove that there was a civilization here, then the Loop of Trade Winds is a land that once declined, and not a natural dark forest. Then wouldn't the book be wrong? You don't look at me like that. I was excellent in my Imperial Chronicles subject, and I was even praised by Master von Hain. Vahina replied uncomfortably under Brando's gaze. Is it the dwarf master who claimed to be able to decipher the Blue Epic? Brando asked. Only part of it. Although Master von Hain is a dwarf, he is a naturalized citizen of the Empire. Vahina raised her chin proudly, unconsciously showing off her identity tag. But doesn't he know that the Druids lived in the Dark Forest 500 years before the people of Erwin? What does he mean by the land south of Randner is a land without a master? Brando mocked. That doesn't count, the Druids have no need for land. Yes, does Cruz dare to use this as an excuse to expel all the Druids from their borders? Then wouldn't the empire's territory expand by another circle? Congratulations. Why you? Compared to this, what really caused Brando's dissatisfaction was the fact that Vahina's Imperial Chronicles included Erwin's history. This was also the reason why this noble lady knew so much about Erwin's past. The people of the Empire had never seen Erwin as an independent country. In fact, he was very clear that in the eyes of the Cruz Empire, especially the nobles who supported the Empire's politics, Erwin was more like an overseas territory of the Empire. It was this kind of arrogance that every player in Erwin could not tolerate. Of course, Brando would not go so far as to make things difficult for a little girl who did not know anything. He was just stepping on the little tail of the noble lady that had just been raised, lest she get carried away. Then the young lord turned around and looked at the lush green forest. This path in the forest did not exist alone. The path had always been used to connect the other parts of the city that originally existed in the forest. Although Brando did not know where this path led to, it did not take long for them to realize this point. After parting the heavy shrubs, the road led to an abandoned ruin in the woodland. The first thing that caught their eyes were the tall buildings piled up with rocks. These buildings were surrounded by a quiet green, quietly standing in the open space here. But just as Brando's head popped out from the shrubs, he felt Sifrid tugging at his hand. He immediately retracted his hand and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" "There's a bad guy." The little girl looked at him and mouthed, "Over there?" Sifrid pointed outside. Brando's gaze followed her finger and saw that she was pointing at the tallest building in the ruins. Brando looked carefully and immediately noticed something strange. There was a plant on the roof of the building that seemed a little strange. Brando suddenly sucked in a breath of cold air. He discovered that it was not a plant but Andesha. She was extremely good at concealing herself, and with her half-druid innate ability, it was difficult for ordinary people to detect her presence. But it was a pity that her opponent was the daughter of the forest, Sifrid, who was favored by the goddess of Naya. Even so, Brando was still frightened to the point where he broke out in cold sweat. He realized that it was a wise choice not to send Sifrid back. There were too many benefits to fighting in the forest with the help of the goddess of the forest's daughter. Brando immediately gestured to Faina, who was following behind him. He then looked outside. This should be a market. Brando recognized it from the circular layout. The tallest building was undoubtedly the temple of the god of trade. In the past, when the god still existed, this temple must have been quite prosperous. And right now, Andesha was standing on the roof of the temple. As a qualified cultist, she did not have a good impression of any gods, nor did she have the most basic respect for them. Even though the gods of Wond had always protected the humans before the War of the Holy Saints, she was still a god of trade. Faina also saw Andesha and was shocked. Why is she here? She quickly looked at Brando and mouthed the question. If you have any intelligence, you would know that she's looking for us. Brendel gestured as he replied. She took a deep breath and complained, "It's all your fault. That's why I said we should turn back. I didn't stop you from leaving." Brendel glared at her, thinking to himself, "I didn't stop you from leaving." However, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to this young lady whose temper had flared up again. He simply mouthed his reply, "I'm sorry, I can't understand such complicated signs." Faina was dumbfounded. If Andesha continued to stay in front of him, he would not be able to find a chance to reach the core of Valhalla first. Since she had stopped, he would not be able to find a way to reach the core of Valhalla. Since she stopped, this was his chance to seize the initiative. Brando raised his head and looked around. He did not see the woman's companions, but he guessed that they should be in the market as well. He looked into the distance and noticed the exit on the other side of the market. He suddenly realized why Andesha chose to stop here. It was because there was a tall wall there. The wall was made of the same material as the buildings here, and it was covered with vines and roots. Most of it was buried in the canopy of the trees, and it was impossible to notice it from a distance. But Brando could not help but take a deep breath when he looked at the wall. If he did not guess wrongly, the wall should be around the World Tree. The two ends of the wall were connected to the World Tree's two mountain-like roots, forming a natural arc of protection. There were several inner walls behind the wall, and there should be a fan-shaped city inside. The idea of using the World Tree's roots to build a fortress was extremely ingenious. If Brando was in his position, he would be extremely satisfied, but he could only feel a bitter taste in his mouth. The only exit was at the other end of the market. If he was not mistaken, Andesha should be monitoring that direction. Although she did not know what this place was for, she was definitely not as simpleton as one of the 12 patriarchs of the Tree Shepherds. At least her judgment was the most accurate. If not for Sifrit, he would have been discovered by her. But there were no ifs in history. Brando had discovered Andesha first, and he had a slight hope of defeating her. But how do I get through the market? Brando felt a headache coming on. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 450. Faina suddenly tugged at his sleeve and Brando turned around. You want to go there? She mouthed the question and pointed at the street in the center of the ruins that was covered with intertwined vines. Brando nodded. You're crazy. Faina looked at him in disbelief. Wait, are you going to use that cloak? If that cloak works, then I'll use it. Brando thought to himself. But a certain Alzheimer's patient didn't even give me the incantation to activate it. Who knows how to use it? He shook his head. Faina looked at him in confusion, but the youth had already gestured for her to stay. Then he crouched down and crawled out of the ruins. His actions caused Faina to jump in fright. She watched as he crawled to a spot less than 10 feet away from the ruins and stopped. She was so frightened that she opened her mouth but did not dare to make a single sound. But Brando did not lose his mind. He knew the consequences of sneaking out like this. Even though he had some experience in stealth, he knew that he was far from being able to match up to the truly powerful Nightingales and Rangers. Even if they were 10 levels lower than Andesha, they could not guarantee that they would not be discovered by a monster like Andesha. This was especially so in the forest, and there was no need to talk about him. Brando knew his own limits and he was just observing from afar. In the forest he could not come to a conclusion just by looking at it from afar. He did not have the habit of wasting time, so he could only choose to take the risk. He hesitated as he laid prone on the ground. His gaze passed through the shrubs and landed on the ruins not far away. His mind spun rapidly as he tried to think of a way to safely pass through the ruins. But that's a bit of a fantasy. Andesha isn't an idiot. Since she's here, it means that she has 100% chance of finding me. Brando stared at the ruins without a clue, and a few unrelated thoughts floated into his mind. If this is a game, then there should be a way to complete the quest, right? Brando suddenly felt a flash of inspiration in his mind. He recalled some things that happened in the game in the past. He vaguely remembered that when the Amber Sword was first released for testing, this game caused a sensation because it was very different from traditional games. This was because most games were designed to test the players. However, no matter how difficult a mission was, it still had to leave a way for the players to complete it. In a simple game, the path was smooth. In a difficult game, the path was full of thorns. But a path full of thorns was still a path at the very least. The Amber Sword, on the other hand, used a completely different design philosophy. The game pursued the greatest degree of realism. There was a famous quote from the game's designer: "There is no path in the forest, you have to rely on your courage and wisdom to open it." Therefore, the Amber Sword didn't have a quest that was impossible to complete. Just like the joke in the Emerald Summit, the design team actually designed a drop list for the Emerald Dragon, but they could have omitted it. Because the Emerald Dragon has always been known as the world's leader that can never be killed. Note, because it has the only highest level of eternity in the entire world of Wond, the Emerald Dragon is defined as existing in countless parallel universes at the same time. Therefore it can't be killed at any place at any time. This is almost equivalent to being immortal. Therefore it is called the Immortal in the Amber Sword, which is a boss that can't be killed. Therefore the drop list that the players jokingly call meaningless because it will never be used. But this was the concept of the Amber Sword. The designer gave it the possibility of being real. Although the players initially called this reality as making things difficult, they eventually accepted this design concept. If the Amber Sword wasn't the only VR game in the world at that time, it would have been abandoned by the players a long time ago. What the players pursued was gameplay and not logic. Brendel could not help but think absent-mindedly. Because of this, he suddenly vaguely felt that he had grasped the idea. If the game's original intention was to provide a possibility of being real, it may seem to be making things difficult for the players, but in fact, it was abandoning the one or only few paths of the past games. If there was no such thing as a strategy, then create your own strategy. This was the so-called spirit of the Amber Sword. Brando took a deep breath. He finally thought of a way. If he couldn't complete the quest perfectly, then abandoning the pawn to save the cart was not necessarily a bad choice. He looked to the side, then calmed down and carefully retraced his steps. But as soon as he stepped out of the bushes, the first thing he saw was Vahina looking at him with a pale face, as if he had done something unforgivable. "My life will be shortened by at least 10 years if I'm with you." She glared at him and said. If that's the case, I'm afraid I'll die prematurely later. Brendel glanced at her and replied. What do you mean? Do you see that ruin over there? We'll use it as a cover to sneak past it. I've looked carefully just now, that's the most likely path, the others are basically dead ends. Brando explained his thoughts clearly, but Vahina looked at the direction he was pointing at and opened her mouth. That looks good, but Country Bumpkin, didn't you notice that there's no cover at the end? We'll definitely be discovered no matter what, right? She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows and refute. I say, that woman is one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders, don't treat her like an idiot. Her appearance here means that she's confident in catching us. Of course I know, I've noticed it too. Brando shook his head, but I know that she's not going to treat us as idiots after her previous experience. Since that's the case, she won't pay too much attention to that direction. I understand the logic of doing the opposite, Vahina frowned, but what's the use of sneaking past the first half? The second half is a flat field, she'll discover us even if she's not paying attention. Brando did not reply. He knew that there was no such thing as perfection. But he had to think of a way to solve half of the problem first, and the rest would be up to him. It was impossible for him to not take any risks at this point in time, and he didn't have much time to waste. Even with William's help, it was still a question of how long the druids outside could last. So he shook his head. Hey! Vahina was so anxious that she almost shouted. She grabbed Sifrid, who was beside her. Sifrid, you have to persuade your big brother. This lunatic wants to commit suicide, I don't want to accompany him. Sifrid looked at the two of them and shook her head. She had no intention of objecting. Brando's decision was her decision. Vahina was speechless. You can stay behind, Brando said. He had no reason to bring her along, especially when it looked like they were going to their deaths. But the Princess of Flowerleaf hesitated. She didn't know why, but she felt a little flustered. She should have agreed, but she looked at Brando and Sifrid and lost her temper for no reason. No, you have to bring me along. Vahina raised her eyebrows in anger. Brendel could not understand the young lady's train of thought for a moment, and could not help but say in annoyance, I say, don't you think you're a burden? Who told you to leave me behind at Lady Veronica's place? You're the one who brought me here, so you have to take responsibility. Are you still a noble if you want to leave me behind? I'm not a noble to begin with, Brando almost shouted out. But he looked at Vahina's serious expression, as if she was going to follow him if he didn't agree. He looked at Sifrid again and finally compromised. It's the same as bringing one or two, isn't it? Brando could not help but think that Vahina was the one who wanted to die, so she couldn't blame him if anything happened. Therefore he sighed and reluctantly agreed with Vahina. Vahina glared at him and heaved a sigh of relief. It was as if she had finally gained the upper hand in this long struggle. Are we leaving now? She asked. Brando wanted to say, aye, but he could only nod in agreement. Moreover, it was indeed time for him to start moving after persuading Vahina. If he was alone, it would be a piece of cake for him to pass through the ruins. Of course, the plaza behind him would still be a big problem. But now that he had Vahina and Sifrid with him, the problem became much more complicated. He did not dare to let Vahina and Sifrid follow him, so he had to carry them back twice. It was a little comical, but the truth was that even if he was carrying a person, his stealth skills were much better than Faina's when she was alone. The first time he carried Sifrid through the ruins was very smooth. He carefully left the forest from the side where the vegetation was dense, then used a broken wall as cover to sneak into the stone house. Just as he had predicted, this direction was facing away from Endesha. She did not pay too much attention to this place because she knew that Brando would be discovered no matter how skilled he was. After settling Sifrid down, he turned around and went back to fetch Vahina. His movements were swift, and he barely made a sound when he passed through the bushes. Vahina from Cruz was stunned by his brilliant technique. She was quite knowledgeable and knew very well that only the best scouts in the army could do such details. Most nobles would not learn such things except for those with special identities. For example, the royal family's spies. Vahina had interacted with her father's spies before, but their skills were nothing compared to Brando's. What she did not know was that Brando did not care about his stealth skills at all. She could not imagine how terrifying the stealth skills of the professional nightingales and rangers in the game were. When one's stealth skill reached level 10 and above, one could even deceive one's eyes. In other words, one could not even notice a person standing right in front of them. Once one reached level 15, they would be able to grasp the legendary visual concealment skill. Disappearing in front of people was an effect that could only be achieved by magic. Magic could dispel it, but stealth could not. The stealth skill of a high-level nightingale was naturally not that simple. Fina finally regained her senses when Brendel picked her up. She was so frightened that she almost screamed out loud, but he quickly covered her mouth with his hand to stop her from screaming. Brendel glared at her fiercely, reminding her to be aware of the situation. Fina's face reddened. Even though this was not the first time he carried her like this, the last time was when they jumped down from a bottomless cliff. She was too frightened to think too much about it. The second time was also when she was trying to dodge the Lernea's attack. She was still conscious this time, but she preferred not to be that conscious. At the very least, she would not feel so embarrassed that her face felt like it was burning. When she finally regained her senses, Brando had already placed her behind a wall. After several trips, Brando finally brought Sifrid and Vahina to the last part of the ruins. The plaza was right in front of them, and the rest was just like what he had said before. It was time to risk it all. He patted the noble lady awake and mouthed, "Are you really not going to stay? You might lose your life if you stay here." Brando tried to scare her away one last time, but the answer he got was still negative. He did not know what was wrong with her, but she shook her head and stared at him with determination. It was as though Cruz had never abandoned his comrades, and Brando felt that something was amiss. "Forget it," he sighed, "I've done my best." He then poked his head out to see how they could cross the plaza. However, his expression changed at once. In fact, he wasn't the only one. Vahina, who was with him, almost cried out in surprise. He saw a figure in red robes standing on the other side of the plaza. "Damn it, I knew it." Brando cursed in his mind. He thought that Andesha would at least make a mistake, even if it was not a mistake in the first place. But he did not expect Andesha to be so meticulous. Her companion was guarding the other side of the plaza, and they did not even have the slightest chance. Brando retreated and gritted his teeth, but he could not think of a solution. But Vahina grabbed his hand. "This distance is already very short, why don't you try using the cloak? It should last long enough." Cloak. Brando was stunned for a moment. He then remembered that Vahina was talking about the cloak that William gave him. He felt a little gloomy and thought that he would have used it long ago. If the cloak could hide from the Dragon King's senses like William said, then it would be a piece of cake for him to hide from Andesha. But there were no ifs. He could not help but shake off Vahina's hand. He suspected that she had lost her mind because of fear. She should have known the reason back then, or was it because William's Alzheimer's disease was contagious? But Vahina grabbed his hand again and asked, "Hey, do you really think that thing can't be activated? Have you forgotten what I do?" Brando was stunned. "What do you do? A noble lady? Go to hell." Vahina gritted her teeth and glared at him. "Bumpkin, I'm a magic swordsman and analyzing incantations is my specialty." Brando was stunned. "You can do it? That thing is at least a mythical item, and the magic circles on it are very different from what we have now. If I remember correctly, you don't even have an official rank, right?" "That's because I'm a noble." Her Royal Highness of the Flowerleaf Estate looked annoyed. "It's impossible for me to participate in the job evaluation of the Adventurers Guild. Besides, as a noble, I've learned much more than the average person." Brando was stunned for a moment, but he suddenly felt that there was a possibility. He stopped and asked with a serious tone for the first time, "Is it really possible?" "I don't know, but I have to try." Vahina did not dare to speak too confidently, but she was much more serious when it came to her profession, and did not put on airs like before. Brendel nodded and handed over the cloak that was wrapped around his hand. Vahina took the cloak and felt it with her hand. It was a purely physical task, for the cloak was, as William had said, astonishingly large. But after a few minutes, Vahina suddenly cried out in surprise. Even though her voice was soft, it almost made Brando jump in fright. He immediately turned around to look at the ruins, but fortunately Andesha did not notice it. He immediately turned around and glared at Vahina. If not for the fact that he was certain that it was impossible, he would have suspected that she was a spy. This time, Vahina seemed to have realized her mistake and showed an embarrassed expression for the first time. She stuck her tongue out at him, but she still happily mouthed to Brando, "Bumpkin, I've learned the magic circles for this thing before." "You've learned it before?" Brando's surprise immediately turned into joy. He did not expect such a coincidence even in his dreams. If Vahina had learned it before, then it would not be difficult to find the activation incantation. With Martha above, he immediately felt that luck had not left him. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 451. Vahina fumbled around the cloak for a while and soon found a clue. Spells had a fixed form. Of course, powerful wizards could do whatever they wanted. But generally speaking, they had to follow the basic principles. The witches who lived on the banks of the magic river all year round believed that there were 36,000 runes full of mysterious power in this world. These runes could summarize all the laws of this world, and runic magic and holy magic were built on this foundation. These runes were also the most commonly used activation spells for magical items. For example, the most common ones were Eem, earth, Oasis, wind, Vo, water, and flame, fire. The aura of the earth on the cloak was very strong. In fact, except for the artifacts made by the silver and gold races, most of the treasures in the earliest era came from the elemental realm. Therefore, the noble daughter tried the giant poem, which described the origin of the earth races. There were 1,200 runes in this codex, and it was almost impossible to try them all. But she was very experienced. Usually, the activation spell had to be chosen according to the ability of the magic item, so the range was very narrow. She tried Yala's Tooth, and Trembling Rune, which represented shadow. Then, her eyebrows twitched slightly, and she raised her head proudly and handed the cloak to Brando. Her sky-blue eyes were filled with the pride of a young girl, and the corners of her pursed lips could not help but curl up slightly as if to say, "How is it?" Brando glanced at her and took the cloak. A line of small green words immediately popped up in his vision. King Buni's Cloak of Concealment. Magic resistance 30%. Activation ability. Enter a state of concealment for 120 breaths. During this time, the character will disappear from the world, although the character can still feel everything around them. Activation spell, far. This meant that the equipment had been appraised. The process of finding out the function of a treasure and the activation spell was called appraisal in the Amber world. Appraisal was indeed a profession similar to spellswordsman and curse knight. Spellswordsmen were not swordsmen who used magic. Although they could use magic, their real strength was in analyzing magic to fight against wizards. They were usually more proficient in anti-magic, not magic. However, Brando was not in the mood to think about anything else when he saw this thing. Everything was obscured. The description was as if it had disappeared from this world. He could not help but twitch the corner of his eye. According to the laws of the Amber Sword, omniscient concealment meant that no one existed in any of the main planes of this world, including the material plane, the 4 elemental planes, and the 2 energy planes. Because these 7 worlds overlapped and formed the entirety of Wand, anyone who existed in this world at any moment had to be based on these 7 worlds, just like how humans had to stand on the ground. This was very different from the original invisibility. In the case of mystery spells, invisibility was a spell that used air or water magic to refract light, or to distort the laws of nature to change the path of light to achieve the purpose of deceiving one's vision. In the end, it was just a type of illusion. Although it could not be seen, it could still be heard and smelled. You might even run into something head-on. However, the All Things cloak was much stronger. At least Brando knew that this thing had a simple use, and that was to pass through walls. Because under the effect of omniscient concealment, the walls that existed in this world did not exist to the target. Although the effect only lasted for a short 120 breaths, which was about 5 minutes, it was perfect for escaping. It was not an exaggeration to say that this thing was a divine artifact to those who needed it, and in addition to its 30% magic resistance, it was definitely worthy of its status as a treasure that existed in legends. The legendary cloak hidden in the Giant King's treasure vault did not disgrace its owner in the slightest. Brando raised the cloak and covered the 3 of them. He chanted, "Far." The cloak suddenly became transparent, and the feeling was very strange. It was as if a layer of water was surrounding them. Sifrid's eyes widened as she looked at the scenery around them. She even looked at Brando with admiration. Young people were always able to do things that she did not expect. But Brando himself also took a while to get used to this state. He knew that they were now under the effect of omniscient concealment. In the game, only famous solo players had equipment with such properties, and he had never seen one before. "How did you know the incantation?" "I didn't tell you." Vahina was extremely shocked. She only reacted at this moment and stared at Brando's face in shock. Brando was stunned. He immediately realized that he had made a grave mistake. In the game, once an item was appraised, the player could directly see its properties and use it. But he forgot that this was not the game. It was the same as the appraisal between NPCs. The appraiser needed to describe the function of the equipment. His actions earlier were considered as foresight. Unless he could prove that he had Hoshi Jian's bloodline, there was a high possibility that he would be burned at the stake. Brando's face stiffened. He looked at Vahina's shocked face and did not know where to begin. It did not make sense for him to say that he already had the ability to appraise equipment, or he would not have waited for Vahina to appraise it. But if he did not, then how did he know the incantation to activate it? Didn't you say that it's a passage in the giant's poem? Other than Yala's fangs, which represents the shadow, there's only one other thing that's related to concealment. So I gave it a try. Brendel coughed, his mind turning quickly. Didn't you say that it's a passage in the giant's poem? You succeeded? Vahina asked in disbelief. It was too easy. Then why did they need experts like them to analyze incantations? Why not just make a guess? The girl's eyes widened. She could not help but be shaken, and she felt a great sense of defeat. No, Brando quickly shook his head. At least Vahina did a good job in this matter, and he did not want to hurt her confidence. You've already determined the range. It's not like I can't sense the fluctuation of mana. You know, I'm only a little knowledgeable in legends and myths. Really? Of course, I'm an elementalist after all. How can there be a gold-ranked elementalist in swordsmanship? Vahina pursed her lips in disbelief. Master Von Kane always said that we humans have limited lives. If we don't put all our energy into one thing, I'm afraid that we won't be able to achieve anything. That's not necessarily true, Brando shook his head. Did you forget that I used magic when I took that thing back from you in the Green Tower? You still have the nerve to bring that up? Taking something from a girl? You're such a disrespectful fellow. Vahina could not help but get angry at the mention of what happened in the Green Tower. She snorted, I thought you were a fake noble, a country bumpkin. I didn't expect you to be the real deal. She snorted, Erwin's people are really rude. Brando wiped the sweat off his forehead. I'm really a fake noble. But he did not agree with Vahina's words. Even though it was wrong to snatch something from a girl, he did not do it for the sake of snatching it. He did it purely to teach a certain someone a lesson for being so self-centered. Anyone would be angry if their item was snatched away while they were bargaining with a merchant, let alone someone who did not follow the rules. Of course, the stone key was still useful to him. That's a different matter. I don't want to discuss who was right and who was wrong with what happened. Brando was in a good mood. He brought Sifred and Vahina out of the plaza. Andesha was still staring at the forest and occasionally glancing at the world tree, but she did not notice the three people walking through the plaza. On the other hand, the man in the red robe standing on the other side of the ruins didn't notice the presence of the three of them either. Brando felt that the man's figure was somewhat familiar, but he could not see his face clearly at such a distance. But unexpectedly Vahina spoke up. That person looks familiar. Familiar? Brando was surprised. He had interacted with many high-ranking tree herders in the game, and it was reasonable for him to recognize one of them or hear their voice. But why would a girl from a high-ranking family find a heretic familiar? I think it's that Amon from Bras. I've met him many times with my father when he was still the Bishop of Floral Ridge, Vahina replied. But why is he here? Amon? Brando almost blurted out, how is that possible? He had met Amon before, but he was pushed into the mouth of the Mistborn and died a few hours ago, in Brando's opinion. He saw with his own eyes that the man's heart was pierced, and as far as he knew, no one could survive a pierced heart apart from the Golden Folk. Even angels could not resurrect them. But with Vahina's reminder, the more he looked at the man, the more he found him to be Amon. Although he could not see clearly from this distance, he was not too far off. In fact, he had felt that something was off from the start, but he did not think too much about it. Is it really Amon? Brando could not help but ask. Are you sure? You speak so strangely. How can I be sure? I can't see anything from this distance. I just thought it was a casual remark. Why are you so serious about it? Vahina grumbled. But for a great cleric to walk together with a heretic from tree herders, what a shocking secret. She licked her lips as if she was a little agitated. If it really is him, Brando said in his heart, then it's not as simple as a secret. Resurrecting the dead, especially when the heart was heavily injured, was absolutely impossible with normal methods. The only way was sorcery. To be honest, Brando did not expect Amon to be related to sorcery. That guy was actually a spy? He took a deep breath. He didn't know what he was thinking, but his mind seemed to be filled with all kinds of information. A great cleric of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was actually a tree herder. This news was too shocking. What surprised him even more was that there was no news about it in the game back then. He thought that NPCs did not have any secrets in front of the players. But just as Brando's thoughts were running wild, a voice suddenly came from behind. "Who's there, hiding your head and showing your tail? Come out." The voice was slightly hoarse, but the tone was so cold that it sent chills down one's spine. Brando almost jumped when he heard the voice because it did not belong to anyone else. It was Andesha. How was it possible that they were discovered? Brando and Vahina were so scared that they froze on the spot. They looked at each other and saw the shock on each other's pale faces. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 452. Who's hiding there? Andesha's cold voice was like a venomous snake spitting out apricots. Her voice reverberated throughout the plaza, causing Brando and the others to freeze. The woman immediately attacked, but surprisingly her attack was not aimed at the square, but at the side of the forest. Thick vines danced in the air, and with a boom several ancient trees were uprooted. As the soil rustled down, a figure suddenly shot out from below. Before Brando could see the figure clearly, the air around him seemed to have stopped flowing, and his vision turned gray. Andesha's whips that filled the sky slowed down in his vision, as if there was a layer of liquid that had increased the resistance. The Gray Domain. The Gray Domain was the ability to change the laws of an area and cause it to enter a world called Gray. This world was located at the boundary between the world of dark energy and the Gray Runic Plains, Earth Elemental. It was a fragmented subworld, and it was one of the many half-planes that were shattered during the War of the Dusk. The War of the Dusk refers to the war between the Golden Age and the Dusk Dragon. After this war, Wond entered the Second Era after the Azure Night shattered the sky. However, the Gray World, that Gray Sword Saint Mephistopheles mentioned, was not a real Gray world, but an ability to materialize illusions. It was the ability to project a world that existed in legends into the material world of Wond. Time passivation was one of them. It was one of the most unique elements in this world, and Brando was certain that the figure was Mephistopheles. Why is he here? Brendel took a deep breath, and his palms were covered in cold sweat. This scene was too exciting, and no one would have thought that this would happen in the end. Mephistopheles jumped forward, but it was not easy. He rolled on the ground to avoid Andesha's whips. He stood up calmly and patted the dust off his body. "You're Andesha?" Andesha snorted coldly. "Gray Sword Saint Mephistopheles, the stray dog. Why aren't you looking for trouble with your nemesis, Cruz? What are you doing here?" Mephistopheles ignored her and continued, "Since you're Andesha, then I'm sorry, but I'm here to take your life. That great demon king Mephistopheles? Who does he think he is? How dare he speak to that woman like that?" Vahina was shocked when she heard Andesha's name. Gray Sword Saint Mephistopheles. In Cruz? If you don't listen, the great demon king Mephistopheles. But when Vahina saw Mephistopheles, he was not as ferocious as she had imagined. On the contrary, this ash sword saint was a handsome middle-aged man. Andesha was also taken aback. She did not expect Mephistopheles to start a fight after just a few sentences. Mephistopheles unsheathed his sword as soon as he finished his sentence. The huge blade of the sword glowed gray under the sunlight. "Ready." Mephistopheles pointed the sword at Andesha and said in a deep voice, "You." Andesha was furious. "Arrogant." She roared, and the sky above the ruins suddenly turned dark. Lightning bolts as thick as dragons rumbled in the clouds. She pointed downwards, and Brando could see 3 mysterious green runes appearing and disappearing around her. Then, countless bolts of lightning struck down from the sky, as if countless lightning tongues had spat out from the clouds. They gathered at a single point and formed a huge fork of lightning. Brendel knew that this spell was the Druid's lightning strike. The 3 runes were Lightning, Fury, and Nature. The lightning bolts created by the lightning strike could be split up to attack each enemy, or it could be concentrated. Each bolt could cause enough damage to kill an ordinary soldier, and the damage would increase according to the caster's bloodline attribute. Each bolt of lightning from Andesha's lightning strike could kill a silver-ranked warrior, and its power was even more shocking when they were concentrated. But it was easy to deal with this lightning strike. All lightning strike spells used metal as their target, and all they had to do was to throw out the most obvious object on their body. But Brando did not expect Mephisto to know the weakness of the lightning strike spell. He immediately threw his long sword to the side, and a blinding ball of lightning gathered on the blade. Ordinary metals would melt under such heat, but magic weapons could absorb the mana in the lightning. The lightning only lasted for a moment before it disappeared, and the sword that was stabbed into the ground was charred black. But Mephisto's sword now had a bolt of lightning as thick as an arm coiling around it, crackling loudly. That sword still has a 40% lightning strike that lasts for 3 rounds, but the damage dealt will not exceed the total damage of the lightning strike spell, Brando muttered to himself. I've heard that Mephisto is a veteran of many battles against Cruz's forces. It seems like he lives up to his reputation today. What did you say? Faina turned her head and asked, unable to hear him clearly. Nothing. Brando patted Sifrid's head. Let's leave while they're still fighting. This is a rare opportunity and it won't come again if we miss it. Faina looked at Mephisto's direction and nodded with lingering fear. Even though Andesha's lightning strike did not cause any real damage, it was still a spectacular sight. The lightning strike was so bright that it looked like the entire world had turned dark, and any normal person would be in awe of such a scene. Mephisto retracted his long sword and turned into a gray shadow that shot towards Andesha's building. But due to his domain, his speed was not fast enough, and Andesha immediately cast a second spell. She summoned the spirit of withering and darkness, and a bloody beast burst out from the ground. It looked like a rhinoceros, but its body was covered in bone plates and spikes. It was about the size of an elephant. This was the tree herder's unique spell, Dark Ally. It was similar to the druid's summoning of animal allies, but the summoned beasts were spirits that had been modified by the blood of gods. She pointed her finger forward, and the rhinoceros charged towards Mephisto. Every time its hooves stomped on the ground, a shockwave would ripple through the ground. If an ordinary soldier was within 10 meters of the rhinoceros, they would have died from the shockwave, not to mention being rammed by the rhinoceros. But this level of attack could only hinder Mephisto's advance. Andesha did not expect the Dark Ally to be able to subdue the Ash Sword Saint. She stretched out her hand and countless vines parted to reveal a rattan staff. It looked a little disgusting and the vines on it seemed to be alive as they waved around like tentacles. Andesha gripped the staff tightly. This was the first time she used a weapon. She raised the staff, and a layer of wooden vines immediately extended from her lower body to her lower abdomen, neck, and cheeks. The vines then wrapped around her entire body, forming a layer of wooden armor. Even her hair was wrapped in the vines, forming a kind of tentacle-like hair. Andesha raised the staff, and her snake-like hair fluttered in the wind. She looked like an evil goddess in the legends. Brando and Vahina rushed forward while looking at the situation behind them. When they saw this scene, they could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Damn, that crazy woman is serious. Brando was surprised. He was surprised that Grey Sword Saint Mephisto was so powerful. He had always thought that Mephisto was slightly stronger than the Cruz Empire's goddess of war, the Azure Sword Saint Veronica, but there was a limit to it. After Andesha finished casting a defensive spell, she raised her head and saw that Mephisto had just killed the dark spirit she summoned. Mephistopheles' method of killing the rhinoceros was too simple. When the dark spirit charged at him, it lowered its head and aimed its sharp horn at him. However, the Ash Sword Saint did not dodge. He grabbed the rhinoceros's horn head-on, and with a loud bang, the rhinoceros that was as big as an elephant was stopped in its tracks. The instant the extreme movement turned to extreme stillness, everyone thought they had seen wrongly. However, the tremendous recoil made the dark spirit's thick bucket-like limbs fall to their knees. Then, with a loud boom, the rocks on the ground were shattered by the recoil, and the dark spirit sank into a huge pit. When Mephisto released his grip, blood flowed out from the rhinoceros's eyes, mouth, nose, and ears. The gigantic creature was killed just like that. Brando and Vahina were dumbfounded. Is he even human? Even though Brendel's strength was greater than this when he was at his peak, he rarely fought in such a barbaric manner. Who would have thought that Mephisto, a middle-aged man who looked gentle and refined on the surface, would be so violent in battle? However, Brando suddenly felt his blood boiling. He could not help but think that this was what a warrior should be like. A true warrior should charge forward and fight to his heart's content. Once he charged forward, he would strike fear into his opponent's heart. Andesha was not afraid, but she was still shocked. Her face was covered by vines, but her eyes flashed. She waved the staff in her hand and gritted her teeth. Go, my children. The ground suddenly shook, and the huge building behind her instantly fell apart. Countless dragon-like vines rushed out from the ground, and these giant green sandworms bent into a U shape in the air before crashing down on Mephisto. Giant plants. Even though Brando did not stop moving, he could not help but stare at this level of battle. It had been a long time since he last saw a battle of this standard, and both sides had rich battle experience. This was because the battle experience of a famous NPC was far greater than that of a normal player. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 453. But when Mephisto displayed his strength, Andesha immediately wanted to use her strength to suppress him. Both of them were prideful people. However, Giant Plant was an 8-circle druid spell, and also the highest circle druid spell that tree herders could cast. Its effect was to increase the strength of the plants by more than 10 times due to their size. In other words, the power of the vines under Andesha's command was not inferior to a true elemental awakened warrior. The dragon-like vines weaved a net in the air, and under Andesha's command, they sealed off all of Mephisto's escape routes. The Ash Sword Saint had no choice but to face them head-on. But Mephisto did not panic. He slowly came to a stop and raised his head to look at the giant tentacles that were waving in the air. The tentacles pounced towards him. He raised his sword and activated Grey World. Then he swung the sword upwards with both hands. Even though they were about 100 meters away, Brando and Vahina suddenly felt the world turn dark. It was as if the only thing left in the world was the grey sword in Mephisto's hand. The grey line extended diagonally upwards and divided the world into two. Then time stopped. With the sound of something breaking apart, the tentacles in the air were all cut off at the same time from their roots. Green liquid gushed out from the severed parts. One could imagine the scene of countless dragons being severed in the air and falling to the ground. It was a spectacular sight. Then the broken plants fell backward one after another. From mid-air, it looked like a chrysanthemum had bloomed in the forest, but this chrysanthemum was green. The vines fell to the ground with a loud crash and swept through a patch of ancient trees in the forest. Smoke and dust filled the air. Mephisto had expended a lot of energy after using the sword. He propped his sword on the ground and gasped for breath. But Andesha was not in a good state either. Her spell was completely destroyed in an instant, and the backlash from the spell almost caused her to explode. In the end, the woman clenched her teeth and sacrificed herself to save the king. Her left hand exploded into a pile of green paste, releasing all the magic power from her left hand. Only then did she manage to save her life. Andesha snorted and glared at Mephisto. She had never suffered such a loss when she fought against the great mages of the Silver Union. The mages were cautious, and their attacks were predictable, unlike Mephisto, who attacked as if he didn't care about his own life. A moment of carelessness would put her in a passive position. "Hamel, how long are you going to wait, you bastard?" She finally couldn't help but roar. "Do you want to be a bystander so that you can reap the greatest benefits?" Hearing this, Mephisto was shocked. He didn't expect this woman to have helpers. Although he had gained a lot of benefits from the previous attack, that attack had gathered almost the entire power of the Grey Realm. Now, he was also unable to continue the attack and could not even gather the scattered elements. He took a deep breath and looked around. He saw a man wearing a golden-red priest robe walk out from behind the smoke. "Are you a cleric from the Holy Cathedral of Fire?" Mephisto frowned when he saw the man's attire. At this time, Brando also saw the man's appearance. Cleric Amon had almost passed by them. Of course, even if he had passed through them, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. However, after Brando confirmed that this man was indeed the dead Amon, he couldn't help but be shocked. Although this man did indeed look like Amon, his face was as pale as a sheet of wax, and his body was covered with black livor mortis. This was not what a living person should look like, but more like an undead. In Brando's view, this was somewhat similar to an undead resurrection spell. This spell was one of Won's famous witchcraft. It could turn a person into an undead at the moment of death, but to cast it, a part of the person's soul had to be separated and placed in a container. Of course, this container could not be a jar or a box, but a living person without a soul. As for how a living person could become an empty container without a soul, this went without saying. This forbidden spell was strictly forbidden by the Holy Cathedral, and only the necromancers of Madara and some cultists would study it. Thus, Brando confirmed that Amon was definitely a spy the moment he saw him. However, his relationship with Andesha did not seem to be that of the tree herders. In fact, there were countless cultists in Wond, and the All-for-One and tree herders were just two of the more powerful ones. Similar to the Silver Heavenly Snake and the Sheephead cult, there were terrifying legends about them everywhere. However, Brando could not help but squint when he saw the black ring on Amon's finger. It seemed that this guy did not intend to return to the Holy Cathedral after his death, so there was no need to hide his identity. The ring was the symbol of the All-for-One. "It's really him, Cleric Amon?" Vahina whispered. Brando nodded. "The All-for-One has really infiltrated the human world thoroughly. Even though they were close, Amon did not hear the conversation between Brando and Vahina. He only smiled at Mephistopheles, good eyesight, but that was just this one's past identity. A dignified cleric of the Holy Cathedral is actually a cultist. The people of Cruz are really depraved. Mephistopheles glanced at Amon and said with some disdain, Count Mephisto, I don't agree with what you're saying. Priest Amon is just one of the rare examples. Besides, Priest Amon isn't from Kurlutz. How can you generalize? A voice suddenly came from the other side of the fog. Brando raised his eyebrows when he heard this voice. Veronica, why is she here? But what surprised him even more was that this Cruz goddess of war seemed to be on the same side as Mephistopheles. How did they get together? He thought that the Ash Sword Saint would never compromise with anyone from Cruz even if the world fell apart. But before Veronica's voice died away, a green light flashed from the other side of the fog. At that time, Amon was about to attack the immobile Mephisto, but the sound of flapping wings suddenly came from the fog. Following that, a flock of green birds suddenly broke out of the fog, flapping their wings as they rushed towards him. The birds seemed to be made of light, and their blue indigo colors were beautiful enough to take one's breath away. But Amon's expression changed when he saw them. These beautiful creatures were actually dangerous, and every feather on their body was sharper than a real longsword. This was because they were made of Veronica's sword aura. Sky Wall. Vahina couldn't help but shout when she saw these green birds, "It's Lady Veronica!" Amon immediately retreated, and 8 runes appeared one after another around him. Then, a hexagonal wall of light suddenly appeared in front of the green birds. The birds crashed into the wall one by one, causing ripples, but they all disappeared in the end. Brando recognized this spell as one of the strongest defensive spells of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Divine Shield. The effect of this spell was to block all attacks, but Amon's spell was obviously much weaker. It seemed that his compatibility with this type of spell had decreased a lot after turning into an undead. Perhaps in a few days Amon would completely lose these spells, but at least for now he could still be considered a powerful cleric. Amon took a step back and looked warily at the lady who came out from the fog. However, Brando looked at the long sword in Veronica's hand with a strange expression. If he wasn't wrong, that sword should be the Ash Sword's backup weapon, the runic sword Gunnis. Since when did the two of them have such a good relationship that they could even exchange backup weapons? Could it be that the Ash Sword Saint's hatred for Cruz's people was just a lie? Or did Veronica cast some kind of spell on him? Brando looked at Veronica and couldn't help but think with a hint of malice. The goddess of war of the Empire was over 100 years old, but she looked like she was in her early 30s. She was still very attractive to Mephisto. Although the Ash Sword Saint was younger, the difference in age wasn't that big. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. Could it be that the Ash Sword Saint and the goddess of war of the Empire had really fallen for each other? It wasn't impossible for them to forget about each other with a smile. Hey Vahina, Brendel couldn't help but ask, why are they together? Did Lady Veronica use the legendary honey trap on Mephisto? Don't talk nonsense, Lady Veronica wouldn't do that. Vahina looked at the scene with her mouth agape, and said with a little lack of confidence. But even though Brando was spouting nonsense, he was still a little worried. He looked around, hoping that Scarlet didn't follow them. Unfortunately, he was disappointed because he soon saw the girl behind Veronica. Sigh, aren't you just causing trouble for me, Lady Veronica? Brando sighed when he saw Scarlet. Let's go out and meet up with Lady Veronica, Vahina suggested softly. Brando immediately grabbed her arm. Wait, let's see what happens first. What's there to see? Your little lover is here, are you not going to stay? Vahina looked at him from the corner of her eyes. Hey, aren't you a noble's daughter? How can you say something like that? Brando couldn't help but cough. Besides, are you stupid? We're in the dark while the enemy is out in the open. Why do you have to go out and let them be on guard? Vahina was stunned. She didn't expect Brando to come up with such an idea. She blushed. Of course not, it's just that I'm not as despicable as you, always thinking about sneak attacks. Are you a noble or not? Aren't backstabbing, poisoning, and assassination your Kurlut's noble specialties? It seems like what I'm doing is in line with your values, right? Brendel replied. Vahina was speechless. She turned around and glared at him with gritted teeth. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 454. When Veronica walked out of the fog, the priestess of the former Holy Cathedral was just as shocked as Brando. Before he could react, the Azure Lady spoke to him. Priestess Amon, you really surprised me. You too, Lady Veronica. Amon replied with a solemn expression. What a surprise. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles is actually working with the people of Cruz. Andesha covered the wound on her left arm with her right hand. Green blood flowed out from between her fingers, but she spoke coldly as if she did not feel any pain. You stray dog over there. Is your hatred for the people of Cruz so shallow? Brando saw that the Sword Saint of Ashes did not show any expression in the face of such mockery. He just stood there as if he did not hear anything. Brando could not help but admire the Sword Saint for his magnanimity and self-restraint. But he did not expect the legendary Sword Saint to raise his head and ask seriously, your sister. Are you a natural idiot? Brando almost choked to death. He could not help but curse in his heart. The Sword Saint of Ashes was the representative of the NPCs who were fearless. He was the idol of countless people, but he did not expect him to be like this. This was the effect of a deified idol collapsing in one's heart. Even though Brando was not a fanatic, the contrast was too great. Andesha's face darkened. Of course, she did not think that Mephistopheles did not hear her words. She thought that he was just teasing her. In other words, he did not even put her in his eyes. Andesha had been an elemental power for close to 200 years, and she had never been looked down upon like this. For a moment, she felt the blood in her body boil. She pointed at Mephistopheles and growled in a low voice, Mephistopheles, 30 years ago I heard that you were the genius of the Mayor people. The Cruz Empire did not hesitate to send troops to suppress the Sutherland Duchy in order to strangle you in the cradle. Fortunately, that woman Martha still cares for you. But it is a pity that you did not cherish it and walk together with your former enemy. You are indeed a genius with your talent, but you are still too far away from me. You should know that I underestimated you and let you take advantage of me, but this kind of situation will not happen again. Cherish your life, young man. Besides, the woman behind you is the goddess of war of the Cruz Empire. Killing her will be a heavy blow to that arrogant empire. You should know this, right? Mephistopheles nodded. I know it, Lady Andesha. But I am here to take your life now. As for my grudge with the Cruz Empire, I will settle it myself later. Don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Andesha gritted her teeth. It was not that she did not dare to make a move against Mephistopheles. She had already grasped his strength in the previous battle. As long as she did not underestimate him, Mephistopheles would not stand a chance. However, she wasn't willing to fight to the death with Mephistopheles. To put it bluntly, she didn't trust Hamel who was with her. She was very clear that that fellow could stab both of them in the back at any time. But when Mephistopheles heard her, he raised his sword and replied, I don't drink any wine. You should know that things that corrode one's mind are harmful to those who pursue the pinnacle of swordsmanship. Yes, and Andesha, you should know that both the Cruz Empire and the Mayor Empire are Martha's people. They are different from monsters like you. To us, you are the greatest enemy. Even if Count Mephistopheles has a grudge with the Cruz Empire, you should still unite against the common enemy, right? Veronica raised her head and crossed her arms as she spoke to Andesha with a smile. This female commander had long green hair that draped over her shoulders, and her smile was exceptionally charming. Andesha was furious. Then you can die. Corrosion, I will show you the power of time. A green domain spread out behind the enraged lord. Everything that was enveloped by the green light was instantly weathered and disintegrated. The stone buildings that had been preserved for tens of thousands of years crumbled under the green light, turning into mud and sand that fell to the ground. The green light extended forward and surrounded Mephistopheles and Veronica in an instant. It looked as if it was about to swallow them whole. Unexpectedly, the green light stopped when it was within 100 feet of the Ash Sword Saint's body. It couldn't advance any further. The streets around the green light turned into fine powder, and the stone slabs cracked to reveal the soil beneath. Plants grew and withered from the exposed soil and the ground turned dark. But the streets beneath Mephistopheles' feet did not change at all. What's going on? Andesha was slightly shocked. Mephistopheles' strength was much weaker than her, and he should not be able to resist her element corrosion. What's going on? Faina, who was hiding under the cloak, also asked in confusion. How is he able to resist the effects of element power from such a long distance? Is he as strong as Andesha? When she discovered that Mephistopheles was on Veronica's side, she changed her title from Great Demon King to That Guy. Element corrosion. Brando's eyes lit up. Corrosion is just a low-level element corrosion, and it is at most on the same level as the dominant element corrosion. But the law of gray is the strongest element illusion, and it is also related to time. In the world of gray, time slows down and corrosion is naturally ineffective. And the elements of illusion are mostly self-determined laws. In that world, the low-level elements of time have to obey the laws of that world. Brando did not say anything else because the so-called elements were divided into 6 levels: micro-elements, mixed elements, strong elements, law power, elemental power, and existential power. Micro-elements were the power that everyone in the world of Wand had. They were also known as the human attribute, but they were not visible and were weak to the point of being undetectable. Mixed elements were the manifestation of strong elements, and they were also known as dominant elements. Most of these elements would appear before a person had truly awakened their element, such as the freeze ability that Brando had displayed. But only those who had truly awakened their element could possess dominant elements. This level was known as the strong element, and it was also the most widely distributed element in the world. Above that was the power of law, such as fantasy, mystery, divine, and nature. After that was the power of elements, which was also known as the highest level of elements. The 4 elements belonged to this level of elements, which was the foundation of this world. Lastly was the existential power, which was parallel to or beyond the definition of the world itself. It was the foundation of the existence of matter and consciousness. Andesha's corrosion was only a low-level element of nature, and its highest level was time. Even though it was of noble origin, it was only a low-level element that was at the level of a strong element. On the other hand, the world of gray, of the Ash Sword Saint, was a genuine fantasy element. Both elements contained the element of time, but Andesha's power was suppressed due to the fact that the low-level element had to obey the high-level element. If not for the fact that she was much stronger than Mephisto, Mephisto could have even used the world of gray to control her element. "You're really lucky, Count Mephisto." Veronica laughed behind Mephisto. Even though she knew how dangerous Andesha's element was, she did not seem to be bothered by it. The young sword saint of the Mayor Empire turned around to look at her, and his dark gray eyes said, "I already know about Andesha's abilities." "I see," Veronica replied. She reached out to protect Scarlet behind her and said to the red-haired girl, "Back off a little, you won't be able to interfere in the battle." Scarlet showed a surprised expression. "You don't have to protect me, Lady Veronica. I'm also a gold-ranked fighter." Mephisto was slightly surprised. "Your lord is also a gold-ranked fighter, isn't he? The Erewhon Empire has produced quite a few people in recent years. I heard that there's a young man called Buga who has outstanding talent and obtained the recognition of the Cross-Sword Saint. Is he also from your empire?" Scarlet nodded. Buga was her vice-commander. However, she did not dare to say that the young Buga was no longer young. He was already middle-aged. "You don't have to look at me." Veronica saw the Sword Saint of the Mayor Empire looking back at her and could not help but grumble. "You don't really believe that woman's nonsense, do you? The Empire did not send troops to the Sutherland Duchy because of you, the Duke's son. Besides, don't worry, I'll do what I say." "That's good." Mephisto raised his sword. "I'll deal with that woman and you deal with the cleric. Is that all right?" "No problem, Amon is not as strong as me," Veronica replied. "That's not necessarily true. You have to be careful," Mephisto said. He then added, "I'm not worried about you, I just don't want you to be a burden to me." Veronica glared at him. No one had ever dared to speak to her like that ever since she became famous. Besides, she was older than this young sword saint. However, Mephisto ignored her and turned his head back without saying a word. The conversation between the 3 of them happened in an instant, and Andesha also noticed the problem. She was so shocked that her face became distorted. Even though her element power was suppressed, it did not mean that she could not do anything to Mephisto. She was the Lord of Tree Herders, and she did not rely on her element power to survive. She let go of her right hand that was covering her left arm and grabbed the wooden staff that was floating in the air. Her eyes were almost spitting fire as she glared at the people below. She gripped her scepter tightly and shouted, "O primal chaos above all things, I revere your power with all my heart. May your wrath and anger burn away all existences that violate the truth of this world. Now, let me borrow your authority and do your thing." A terrifying chill ran through everyone's heart. "Seventh moon, I call upon your name, Ankaram, and all things return to the same path." Andesha raised her staff and pierced through the vines covering her body. Black scales that flowed with blood grew out from her body. "Come, dragon of chaos, dusk." Note, Ankaram is the name of the 7th moon. The witches believe that this moon is the reflection of the shadow and destruction magic in the sky. It represents the brutality and killing intent of the dusk dragon. Ankaram and the fourth moon, Akana, are twins. Akana represents judgment and rebirth in the legends of the Cruz, and is also the moon of wisdom for the Buga Magi. Horns grew out from her hair and the sun in the sky dimmed. A pair of wings covered in scales spread out from her back. She shook her head and tail and her neck lengthened. Her fingernails became sharp and her body grew bigger and bigger. She's really angry now. Take Sifrid and find a place to hide. Don't get too close or the wind blades from the battle will scratch your face. Don't blame me for not warning you. Brendel said to Faina as he pulled out Haurangaya from his back and gripped the hilt tightly. Find a place to hide with Sifrid and don't get too close. Why? I'm not afraid. I want to go as well, I'm a warrior too. Vahina's eyes widened as she reached for her dagger, but she remembered that she had lost it earlier. I can use magic to help you. You want to go? Brando looked at her. Are you saying that you want to leave a child like Sifrid alone on this battlefield? You're really vicious, woman. Vahina was at a loss for words. She glared at him. All right, I understand. But if you lose, I'll make fun of you. Lose? Brando looked at the battlefield outside. Even if I lose, I don't need you to make fun of me. No one here will be able to survive. However, he was more concerned about Amon. He knew that he could not interfere in the battle between Andesha and Mephisto. He raised his sword and stared at the battlefield, waiting for Amon to exchange blows with Veronica before launching a sneak attack from the back. However, if the young miss beside him knew what he was thinking at this moment, she would probably scold him for having a dark heart and only thinking about sneak attacks. But in Brando's eyes, he would be a fool if he did not launch a sneak attack. Ambushing NPCs was a player's specialty, and it would be a waste if he did not use it. Hey, you probably don't know who Song Xianggong is, little girl. This is the power of transmigration, and chaos is nothing compared to it. He glanced at Vahina, then at Andesha, who had completely transformed into a dragon. Instead of criticizing her, it would be better to say that he was encouraging himself. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 455. But you can help me with something. Brando turned around and said to Faina. Help? Faina looked at him with a puzzled expression. Analyze the runes on Amon's body and tell me the parts that are related to defense. Are you going to deal with Amon first? Nonsense, of course I'll pick the weakest persimmon first. Brando stared at Amon's back and said. He had another choice, which was to take control of Valhalla's core while Andesha fought with Veronica and Mephisto. But he chose to stay because of two reasons. The first was because of Scarlet. It was not a short distance from here to Valhalla's core, but Mephisto was obviously not Andesha's opponent. Leaving Veronica and Scarlet here was not a wise decision. But the more important reason was that he found an opportunity. Andesha and Amon were tree herders and All for One. All for One's influence was deep in human society, and the tree herders were a bunch of lunatics. Brando did not wish for them to return to the civilized world and become his enemy. The only way was to get rid of these two people here and let everything that had happened here be buried in the Black Forest forever, eliminating all future troubles. That was why he tried to instigate William, but the Archmage of the Silver Alliance was too cautious and did not let him gain any advantage. But now Mephisto's appearance gave him a second chance. Brando knew that Andesha's most troublesome aspect in battle was her corrosive domain, but the Ash Sword Saint was able to counter it. In this way, Andesha's well-concealed weakness was exposed. All right, I'll try, Faina replied, but his level is too high, I can't guarantee that it'll work. Don't worry, Brando comforted her. He's already an undead, the holy spell will reject his body and manifest itself. It's not as difficult as you think. Faina nodded. The Lady of Azure approached Amon and looked at him. Priest Amon, it's not too late to turn back. I don't want to attack you because of our personal friendship in the Empire. Turn back? Amon sneered. Will the Holy Cathedral accept an undead as their priestess? Besides, you should have heard of the resurrection of the undead spell, right? Veronica, don't try to flatter me. You know that it's useless to me. Veronica was not surprised by Amon's answer. She just wanted to shake his mind, but the will of the undead was as cold as steel. It did not affect the fallen priest at all. Without another word, she flicked the sword in her hand, and a string of green birds flew out from the sword. They flew in a beautiful arc towards Amon from both sides. Amon pointed his finger. Golden flames, give me a shield. Several golden shields appeared and disappeared, each colliding with one of the green birds and causing sparks to fly in the air. Blessing of Flames. Faina said. This spell is an active defensive spell, but if the caster is unable to detect it, then it's useless. Continue. Brendel stared at the gap behind Amon's back as he spoke with Haurangaya. There's also a spirit barrier. It's a passive defense. It only protects the front 180 degrees. What else? Arcane armor. Foresight attack. That's a little troublesome. That's all? I think that's all. Brendel nodded and lifted his cloak with one hand. At this moment, Amon was in the midst of a fierce battle with Veronica. He did not expect 3 people to be hiding less than 10 feet away from him. With his abilities, it was impossible for someone to hide at this distance without him noticing, unless they were 10 times stronger than him. But then again, it didn't make much of a difference whether or not someone who was 10 times stronger than him sensed his presence. Besides, Amon definitely wouldn't think that someone who was 10 times stronger than him would sneak up on him. There was no need for that. The moment Brendel took off his cloak, the foresight attack on Veronica immediately alerted him, but he was too busy fighting with Veronica and did not have time to turn around. Moreover, the warning from the spell was not strong, which meant that the people who were hostile towards him were still some distance away. Unfortunately, what Amon did not know was that Brando also knew how the foresight attack worked. He calmed his breathing from the start so that his killing intent was not that obvious. As a true veteran player of the Amber Sword, Brando had a wealth of experience. He was even more dangerous than the mage hunters. The moment he appeared, Veronica saw him and Vahina behind him. The woman's eyes lit up. She was curious as to why he was here, and why did he not let her and Amon notice him at such a close distance. But despite her doubts, the woman's expression was calm. She did not alert Amon at all. As a female general who had experienced hundreds of battles, being calm in the face of danger was the most basic quality of a general. Brando was well aware of this, and he believed that the war goddess of Cruz would not disappoint him. As expected, not only did Veronica not expose his presence, but she also immediately understood his tactic and took a step forward to attack. Oh, you also noticed that reinforcements are coming? But it's useless. That brat should still be far away. This little bit of time is more than enough for me to deal with you, Veronica. Amon was still talking to himself. Priest Amon, did I not know that depravity can make people arrogant? Veronica smiled faintly. Behind you, idiot. At this moment, Andesh's shrill voice suddenly came from above. Amon was startled, suddenly shocked. But at this moment, Brando had already made his move. The arcane armor on Amon was a triggered full-body defense spell. It was also the most effective weapon a wizard could use against rogues. Arcane armor, and predictive attack, was the common choice of all high-level mages in the early stages of the game. It was also the reason why the nightingales complained to the heavens. But it was only useful in the early stages of the game. The player's creativity was limitless, and a battle between a spear and a shield would never end with one side winning. Brando did not directly stab Amon's back with his sword. He raised his right hand and chanted, Oasis. A wind bullet was shot out and hit Amon's back with a loud bang. The arcane armor on Amon's body reacted immediately. A layer of silver-white square-shaped light spots appeared on his back like fish scales. The layers of light deflected the wind bullet's lethality into nothingness. But after the silver light appeared, it quickly weakened. The arcane armor could only block one attack in a short period of time. Brando knew this very well. He took the opportunity to deceive the arcane armor and immediately slashed at Amon. After breaking through the arcane armor, Amon was no better than an ordinary person in front of Brando even though he had elemental power. This was the biggest weakness of priests and wizards. Their physical strength was too weak. The Haurangaya cut through Amon's back like cutting through tofu. The high priest screamed and fell forward. Veronica's sword pierced through his lower abdomen, and Amon howled in pain again. But even so, the undead spirit did not suffer any fatal injuries. It took a step back, pulled out its sword, and turned around in a panic to escape. A zombie? Brando was stunned. Cut off his head, Miss Veronica. Don't even think about it. Amon howled with hatred. He raised his hand and the red bracelet on his hand exploded with a bang. A circle of white light suddenly enveloped him and he disappeared. When he reappeared, he had fallen 100 meters away with an arrow in his back. Dich. Brando spat and looked in the direction of the corpse. He put down the shale longbow in his hand and said, Isn't it just the anywhere door? You think I can't tell where you're going? Veronica stood aside and looked at him with a smile. Brando, where did you get your combat experience? In crews, even the best young knight I've seen is not as good as you. I'm a descendant of the Highland Knight. Fighting with mages is a talent that I inherited from my bones. Brando replied casually as he returned the blue firmament to Veronica. Go deal with Andesha. I have a way to kill her. Veronica looked at him curiously. Brando shook off the blood on his sword and looked at Andesha, who was not far away. Andesha had been paying attention to the battle. When she saw that Amon had failed, she could not help but stare at Brando with hatred. However, at this moment, the woman had turned into a black dragon. She was entrenched on top of the building like a giant beast lurking in the shadows. Even though she herself was the shadow. The battle had become 3 against 1, but Andesha did not show any signs of retreating. The leader of the tree herders had her own pride. She did not care about Brando and Veronica in the first place, and did not think that these two people who were much weaker than her could pose a threat to her. How do you plan to deal with that woman? She's not an ordinary person. Veronica looked at Brando and asked. I have my ways. Actually, I suggest that you bring Vahina and Scarlet away from here. Brando, Andesha is not that easy to deal with. I'll convince Mephistopheles to delay her. What about you? Brando turned to look at Veronica. Me. As a general of the Empire, dying in battle is not a disgrace. Veronica smiled. Vahina's identity is special, I have to protect her. It's not that serious. Even though Andesha has turned into a dragon, she only has the physical defense and strength of a race that inherited the golden bloodline. Brando sheathed Haurangaya and walked towards Andesha. The true strength of the dragon race is the magic that flows through their bodies. You should know that the silver elves and humans' knowledge of magic comes from the dragon race, right? Veronica nodded. That's why Andesha's strength has its weakness. Brando lowered his voice. She's a druid after all. As long as her connection with nature is cut off, she'll be useless. That won't be easy. But it's not like there's no way. Brando said, if there's anything in this world that can cut off the connection between a region and nature, it would be the golden demonic tree. The golden demonic tree? Brando nodded. Is Andesha digging her own grave by injecting the blood of gods into me? P.S. A classmate told me that I didn't post it yesterday, but I realized that I didn't post it yesterday. I'm sweating like a waterfall. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 456. Faina stood on the battlefield with Sifred in her arms. She suddenly felt someone pulling her from behind. She turned around and saw a red-haired girl with a ponytail looking at her sternly. Don't stand here, it's too dangerous. As he spoke, he pulled her back without giving her any chance to explain. Scarlet? Sister Scarlet. Scarlet patted Sifred's head and said to Faina, come with me. You can't interfere in the Lord's battle, and this place will be affected by it. What? He only dares to fight because of the Sword Saint. Wasn't he just as afraid of that woman as we were? Faina replied in annoyance, but she did not dare to continue when she saw Scarlet glaring at her. Sister Scarlet, look over there. Sifred tugged at Scarlet's sleeve. The ponytail girl was startled and raised her head in confusion. Brando said that he would use the golden demonic tree to absorb the force of nature in an area. Of course, he could not plant the golden demonic tree in a battle, but it was enough to achieve a certain effect. Andesha and Mephisto were currently fighting in the air. The Withered Lord had the upper hand in terms of strength, but Mephisto relied on his techniques to remain undefeated. Both of them noticed Brendel and Veronica on the ground, but Andesha slyly avoided Mephistopheles from moving the battlefield to the ground to avoid being caught in a pincer attack. Your helpers aren't useful. Andesha sneered. Mephisto didn't have the time to reply, and his calm eyes showed that he didn't want to answer. Or rather, his answer was the giant sword in his hand. The giant sword stabbed forward, and a 100-meter-long blade of light was formed by Grey Sword Chi. Andesha snorted and turned her huge body in midair to avoid the sword. She swept her wings that were covered with steel scales and knocked Mephisto's sword aside. She then clawed at Mephisto's head. At the same time, she tried to set up a small area of lightning storm behind Mephisto so that she could use this level 5 spell to seal off his escape route. Andesha's claws were fast and vicious, and Mephisto's head would have been turned into a ragged sack if she had hit him. But at this moment, the woman realized that her spell was one step too slow. The lightning that should have been summoned in an instant was dodged by the human sword saint. What's going on? Andesha was shocked. She realized that the flow of mana in her body had slowed down by a fraction. Although it was only a fraction, the slightest change in the flow of mana would alert any caster. Andesha lowered her head and immediately noticed Brando's actions. It wouldn't be appropriate to call it a small trick. This was because Brando was letting the blood flow down from his wrist and onto the shrubs on the ground. As he walked forward, the shrubs immediately grew crazily and formed a black belt. Golden tree. Andesha didn't think about how Brando knew the secret of the golden tree, but she knew that the golden tree had the ability to disrupt the flow of nature. She was shocked and angry and immediately threw Mephisto aside and swooped down. At this moment, Brando and Veronica heard a sharp whistle and felt the sky above them turn dark. They looked up and saw a black cloud pressing down on them. Veronica's expression darkened, and she immediately pulled out her sword to block in front of Brando. On the other hand, Mephisto naturally wouldn't allow Andesha to change her target so easily. Although he didn't know what Brando was doing, he could clearly feel that Andesha's spell had slowed down by a fraction. Looking at the monster's reaction, he could guess that it was related to the youth below. Mephisto pursed his lips and immediately turned his sword to stab at Andesha's exposed back. "Scram, you wretched vermin." Dark lightning. The tree shepherd's lord of the withering trees let out an angry roar, and black lightning began to appear around her body. These lightning bolts seemed to listen to her commands as they crisscrossed through the air, and a few of them struck Mephisto's sword. The sword saint of Sutherland felt his hand go numb, and a huge force came from his sword, causing him to almost lose control of it. The power of the lightning was extremely strange, and it didn't have the numbing effect of ordinary lightning. Instead, it had a burning sensation that pierced his heart. Mephisto immediately switched his sword to his left hand, and when he looked at his right palm, there were no traces of burns. Instead, it was completely black. Corrosive damage? The sword saint was slightly stunned. He was quite knowledgeable, and he recognized that this wasn't ordinary lightning, but a substance formed by the element of darkness. However, while the sword saint of ash was obstructed by Andesha, the evil dragon had already arrived above Veronica and Brando's heads. She circled in the air and attempted to stop Brendel, but Veronica stood in front of Brendel and raised the azure firmament in a battle stance. Andesha took a deep breath. She knew that if she wanted to attack Brando, she couldn't avoid Veronica. Even though the crew's goddess of war wasn't as strong as her, she had no problem obstructing her from the side. She hesitated for a moment, then stretched out her claws. Countless vines grew out from the ground and pierced towards Brando. The vines were twisted plants that had been corroded by the darkness, and when they broke out from the ground, they looked like countless poisonous snakes. Veronica frowned and had to lead the vines to the side to prevent them from affecting Brando's work. How much longer? Don't fight her head-on. Let Mephisto stall her. Brando replied without raising his head. He stared at the bushes on the ground. Under the nourishment of the blood of gods, the black thorns grew at a speed visible to the naked eye. Andesha became anxious when she saw this. Even though the plants weren't enough to completely distort the natural order of this place, it was enough to affect her connection with nature. She was a druid, and after losing the magic that she was so proud of, her close combat ability wasn't much better than Mephisto's. With Veronica at the side, her chances of victory were even lower. Especially in a battle of their level, victory and defeat were often decided in an instant. The slightest tilt in the balance of a battle could affect the final outcome. She immediately lowered her head and let out a low growl. The vines that came out from the ground were closing in on her, and Veronica was completely entangled by them. Andesha narrowed her eyes and took the opportunity to fly towards Brendel's direction. She did not care if she had 100% chance of success. She opened her wings and flew towards Brendel's direction. A terrifying shriek rang out in the air. Brando finally raised his head and looked at the direction where Andesha dove towards with a calm expression. Of course, he was extremely nervous at this moment. Even the most dangerous mission in the past wasn't as exciting as this moment. She was one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. She was at least 40 levels higher than him, and if it was in the game she could kill him with a single breath. It wasn't as simple as losing a level in the game, but a real death. But Brando's mind was extremely clear at this moment. He glanced to the side and noticed Veronica's situation, and a plan formed in his mind. He came up with a countermeasure in an instant and swung his sword towards Veronica's direction. Even though the crescent-shaped sword chi from the white raven sword style bounced off the vines without causing any damage, Brando didn't count on it. With a thought, a sharp rock pierced out from the ground. It didn't pierce through the vines, but it temporarily blocked them from the other side. Veronica was finally able to escape. She took a step forward and raised her sword without any hesitation. Green light radiated from her body and surged out in all directions. She raised Cyan Firmament and swung it at Endesha. A Cyan Wind Dragon that was 1/10 of Endesha's size flew out from the blade and crashed into the evil dragon in midair. Endesha was in the final stages of her dive and couldn't change her direction. She could only watch as the Wind Dragon crashed into her shoulder. Of course, the Wind Dragon was only an illusion. In reality, the sword chi tore through the scales on her shoulder, causing blood to spurt out. But that was all. Endesha only felt intense pain, and her movements slowed down slightly. Brando took the opportunity to dodge her claws and regroup with Veronica on the other side. Lady Withering was furious and wanted to chase after him, but a chill ran down her spine and she stopped. She turned around and saw that Mephisto had already torn apart the black lightning and was chasing after her. Even though Endesha was dispirited, she had no choice but to turn around and fight. She wasn't so careless as to expose her back to the Sword Saint of the Mare tribe without any preparation. Mephisto had already used his strength to tell the tree herders that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Brando took the opportunity to scatter the black thorns on the ground. These thorns were cultivated on the spot, and their effects were minimal. At least from the young man's point of view, he would need at least 4 more thorns of the same size to turn the tide of the battle. This wasn't an easy task because Endesha was constantly trying to stop and destroy the fruits of his labor. At first, she used a more direct method, but Mephisto didn't give it to her for nothing. Even though the Sword Saint of the Mare tribe seemed a little off the mark, he could see that Brando's thorns were the key to turning the tide of the battle. Endesha's spells were getting slower and slower, and Mephisto's battle was getting easier and easier. There were even times when he had the chance to counterattack, which was unimaginable in the beginning. Thus, he decided to follow behind Endesha like a haunting ghost, not giving her any chance to make a move. Endesha quickly realized Mephisto's tactic, and she had no choice but to stop her clumsy actions and use her element of corrosion to corrode the thorns. This had a miraculous effect in the beginning, and almost caused Brando's work to go to waste. However, Mephisto quickly found a way to defend himself under Brando's guidance. He simply used his Ashen World to cover the black thorns, preventing Endesha from attacking. This move almost drove Endesha crazy, but there was nothing she could do. Her element of corrosion couldn't do anything to Mephisto. Both sides chased after each other and the black, Great Wall was slowly built. Even though Brando was starting to feel dizzy due to the excessive blood loss, Endesha's battle prowess was also starting to crumble. Her last spell almost failed, and the backlash from the spell almost caused her to lose an eye. Thus, a strange scene appeared on the battlefield. One of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders was being dragged into the abyss by an unknown noble called Erwin. Even Mephisto, who was fighting against Endesha, could not believe his eyes. Veronica was supporting Brando. Endesha was furious, but she finally started to feel a little uneasy. She knew that there was no other way out but to lose. The leader of the tree herders finally regained her senses. She turned around in midair and prepared to escape. "Don't let her escape," Brando immediately shouted. The Golden Tree's area of influence was large enough to cover an entire valley, and it was already too late for Endesha to think of escaping. But at this moment he heard Scarlet scream, "Be careful, my lord." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 457. Be careful. Scarlet suddenly shouted as Brando focused on dealing with Endesha's attack. Brando's heart skipped a beat as he turned around, only to see a ray of black light coming at him. Brando did not have time to react, but his rich combat experience made him lunge forward. He felt a sharp pain in his back as he was shot. Damn it! Brando cursed as he gritted his teeth in pain. He had already guessed who the attacker was, and the only one who could have attacked him from that direction was Amon. But he was surprised that Amon did not die. After taking a hit from Haurangaya, he was hit by an arrow as well. Damn, is that guy a cockroach that can't be killed? In Brando's experience, a cleric was just a cloth armor class. He would not survive such an attack even if he was an undead. He immediately turned around and saw Amon crawling up from the rubble, stones and debris falling from his body. However, the priest who betrayed the Holy Cathedral of Fire was equally surprised. He probably did not expect Brendel to be able to dodge his attack. Huh. He looked at Brando with a strange expression and said, "I have seen the most elite soldiers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire before. You are not as simple as a nobleman of Erewhon. Amon was quite a distance away from Brando, but his voice could easily reach him. Brando knew that it was a communication spell. Brando cursed in his heart. If he was just a nobleman, would he appear in this place? He checked his injuries. The green light projected on his retina constantly refreshed the data, quantifying the damage. Brando took a look and found that it was less than 10% of his life force. But because he had used his blood to feed the golden tree, or perhaps it should be called a magical thorn, he had lost too much blood. His life force had turned yellow. In fact, Brando could feel weakness creeping up his limbs, and a heavy feeling seemed to be dragging him to the ground. I have to end this quickly. He shook his head and tried to stay awake. The situation was not good. Even though the ground was covered in thorns, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles did not have the upper hand against Endesha in the air. It was just that the Lord of Withering Weeds was in a hurry to leave the area, and Mephistopheles was able to hold his ground for the time being. Endesha should be aware of this, and if this situation continues, it will be disadvantageous for her. She will definitely find an opportunity to break the stalemate. Brendel analyzed in his mind as he stared at Amon, who was not far away. He knew that the tree herders were not benevolent people. Even if there was only a sliver of hope, they would fight to the death. The battle above him would end quickly, but he did not have the time to care about other things. Amon was right in front of him, and it seemed like he had planned this beforehand. Otherwise, he would not have pretended to be killed when he was hit by the petrification arrow. Brando believed that not only him, even Endesha thought that her companion was dead. But this guy is resurrecting now. Is it because he saw that Endesha's situation is not good? Or is it because of other reasons? Brando frowned. If it was the latter, it meant that Amon had some sort of confidence. It was like a schemer coming out from behind the scenes. Unless he was forced to do so, he must have the confidence to win. Even if he thought that he could win, it was still the same. Where did his confidence come from? These thoughts flashed through Brendel's mind for a moment. Then he heard the sound of footsteps. Veronica was already beside him. The plaza was already in ruins from the previous attack. Veronica was also frowning. She knew Amon better than Brando. She did not like this cleric as he was too shrewd. But such a gloomy person would definitely not stand in front of the stage so casually. There seemed to be a thick smell of conspiracy in the air. Amon looked at the two of them with a smile, as if he had seen through their thoughts. You must be curious as to why I am here. But this is indeed surprising. Valhalla actually exists. No matter what, I have to thank you for helping me. He took out a book from his bosom as he spoke. The book was covered in black smoke, and it was obvious that it was not a good item. Or rather, it was more like an evil item. Amon, what are you talking about? Veronica frowned and asked. Veronica, you still don't understand? Valhalla has maintained the stability of the loop of trade winds for thousands of years. As long as we destroy that hidden flame, not to mention Erewhon, even the Cruz Empire will be greatly affected. It is an honor to be able to destroy an empire with my own hands. Amon opened the book in his hand and said, not to mention, legend has it that Valhalla hides a secret about history. You and I are fortunate enough to witness it all. You are crazy. Veronica frowned. Although she did not like this cleric, she could not help but be shocked to hear him say such words. No, don't you always call us crazy? Amon shook his head and smiled sanctimoniously. In fact, we are all the same. The Cruz Empire has been killing for thousands of years to conquer. Compared to them, our actions are relatively more noble. You are simply twisting words and forcing logic. Veronica's sword-like eyebrows stood up. Her last words seemed to be dragged out as she charged straight at Amon. One person and one sword like a hazy green light. However, Amon seemed to have expected this. He opened the book in his hand, and a black curtain of light suddenly appeared 100 feet away from him. Veronica's sword landed squarely on the curtain of light. Not only did it have no effect, but a strong light flashed on the curtain of light and almost knocked her sword out of her hand. The sword saint took a step back with difficulty and barely managed to regain control of Azure Firmament. However, the huge force on her arm forced her to kneel down and let out a muffled groan. It doesn't matter if you are twisting words and forcing logic. Veronica, if you have any last words, you can tell me. I will respect your choice. Amon held the book in one hand and looked down at the sword saint condescendingly. He said it so casually as if the life and death of everyone present was in his hands. Endesha, who was fighting Mephisto in the air, became even more dissatisfied when she saw this scene. Her comrade clearly had the ability to deal with Mephisto easily, but he chose to feign death and put her in a difficult position. Even if she knew that their so-called cooperation was not worth mentioning, she still couldn't help but roar, "Hammer, why aren't you getting rid of those bastards? What are you waiting for?" However, Amon only raised his head and glanced at the sky as if he didn't care about Veronica at all. He then lowered his head and continued to speak to Veronica. "So, what do you think of my suggestion?" Veronica held her numb wrist and looked at Amon with a gloomy expression. She didn't expect this cleric to be hiding his strength all this time. At least from this spell, his strength wasn't inferior to Andesha's. The huge difference in strength made her heart turn cold. Andesha alone was enough to make them use all their strength to deal with her, and now there was another cleric. Veronica couldn't think of a way to win. But just as she lowered her head and thought of a way to turn the tables, Brando's voice suddenly rang out, "Don't listen to him. That's just the power of the book. The Wall of Chaos only has 3 chances of absolute defense. I bet that guy doesn't have the ability to cast it a second time." The young man's voice startled Veronica. Although she didn't dare to believe Brando's words, she saw Amon's expression as if he had seen a ghost when she looked up. However, the traitor of the Holy Cathedral of Fire wasn't in the mood to pursue this matter. When Brando said those words, he felt like his head had been hit by a meteor. Because Brando wasn't wrong at all. Although the Green Sword Saint was a woman, she had rich experience in the battlefield. She only needed to look at Amon's expression to know that Brando was telling the truth. At least most of it was true. She immediately had a plan in her mind and rushed towards Brendel with her sword. When Amon reacted, it was already too late. He cursed under his breath, "Damn it." He grabbed the book in his hand and retreated. At the same time, he released 2 rays of black light from his hands in an attempt to stop Veronica's actions. Unfortunately, the gap between him and the Empire's goddess of war was too big. Veronica easily passed through the gap between the 2 rays of black light and slashed her sword at the black screen. The screen flashed, and Amon panicked as he tried to think of a way to block it again. But at this time he saw Brando in the distance taking out a longbow from under his cloak. "Bastard!" Amon cursed. Brando's actions were always perfect. He even suspected that the 2 of them were longtime partners. But he didn't know that with Brando's current experience, he could easily work with anyone. The bowstring twanged and the black screen disintegrated. Veronica immediately took the opportunity to charge forward, but she didn't expect Brando to stop her. Careful retreat. The Book of Mavicard is not that simple. The Sword Saint completely believed Brendel's words at this moment. She stopped abruptly, and in a moment, less than 5 feet in front of her was instantly annihilated by the collapse of the mana. The rocky surface was actually turned into fine powder under the huge pressure. If she had taken half a step forward before, she would have been crushed to pieces. After the terrifying tremor, the square was once again filled with smoke and dust. Veronica couldn't help but take a light breath and look back at Brando. "Be careful, he still has room to fight back." But Brando's voice continued to come from behind the smoke. He put down Haurangaya, but his tone was not relaxed. "To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.